Welcome to this journey through ancient history. As you settle in and let yourself relax, we'll explore 10 moments that mark the end of the independent Israelite kingdoms. Let the facts wash over you gently, like waves on a distant shore. Fact 1. The year 722 BCE and the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel to Assyria. In the year 722 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel came to an end. For nearly 2 centuries, this kingdom had existed as a separate entity from its southern neighbor, Judah. The people of Israel had built cities, cultivated lands, and maintained their own royal dynasty. But the Assyrian Empire, vast and powerful, swept through the region like a storm. The Assyrians were known for their military might, their organized armies, and their policy of conquest. When they turned their attention to Israel, the kingdom could not withstand the assault. The capital city of Samaria fell after a siege, and with it, the political independence of the northern tribes came to a close. This moment marked a fundamental shift in the history of the Israelite people, the beginning of a long period without self-rule in the northern territories. Fact 2. The deportation of Israel's elites. After the fall of Samaria, the Assyrians implemented a policy they had used elsewhere in their empire. They deported the elite members of Israelite society, the priests, the scribes, the wealthy landowners, the skilled craftspeople, and the political leaders. These were the people who held knowledge, who maintained traditions, who kept records and memories. The Assyrians took them far from their homeland, scattering them across distant regions of the empire. This deportation became known in later tradition as the story of the 10 lost tribes. These exiled Israelites were resettled in distant lands, in Media, in northern Mesopotamia, in places where they would be absorbed into other populations. Over time, their distinct identity faded, mixing with the peoples around them. The deportation ensured that any potential rebellion would be leaderless, that the collective memory of independence would slowly dissolve. Fact 3. Population mixing and the origins of the Samaritans. With the elites removed, the Assyrians brought in other conquered peoples to settle in the former kingdom of Israel. These newcomers came from Babylon, from Cutha, from other parts of the Assyrian realm. They brought their own gods, their own customs, their own ways of life. The remaining Israelite population, those who had not been deported, began to live alongside these foreign settlers. Over generations, intermarriage occurred. Religious practices blended, and a new hybrid culture emerged. This was the beginning of what would later be known as the Samaritans. They maintained a form of worship centered on Mount Gerizim. They preserved their own version of the Torah, but they were seen by the southern kingdom as religiously mixed, as different. This population mixing created lasting divisions, social boundaries that would persist for centuries, separating those who had remained in the land from those who would later return from exile. Fact 4. The year 586 BCE and the fall of the kingdom of Judah to Babylon. More than a century after the fall of Israel, in the year 586 BCE, it was the southern kingdom of Judah's turn to fall. The Babylonian Empire, having risen to replace Assyria as the dominant power in the region, besieged Jerusalem. King Nebuchadnezzar's armies surrounded the city, cutting off food and supplies. The siege lasted for months, and within the walls people starved. The kingdom that had survived the Assyrian onslaught, that had maintained the Davidic dynasty, that had guarded the temple in Jerusalem, could no longer hold out. When the walls were finally breached, the Babylonian soldiers poured in, the Kingdom of Judah, the last remaining Israelite state, ceased to exist as an independent entity, the shock of this loss reverberated through the generations that followed. Fact 5. The destruction of Jerusalem. When the Babylonians entered Jerusalem, they did not simply occupy the city, they destroyed it methodically. The walls that had protected the inhabitants were torn down, stone by stone. The houses of the wealthy were burned. The administrative buildings, the palace of the king, the structures that represented political power, all were reduced to rubble. Jerusalem, the city that had been the center of Judean identity, that had been celebrated in psalms and songs, was left in ruins. The destruction was total, meant to erase not just the political power, but the physical symbols of that power. For those who witnessed it, for those who survived, the sight of their city demolished was a wound that would define their understanding of loss for generations to come. Fact 6. The destruction of the First Temple. The most devastating blow was the destruction of the First Temple. This was the house that Solomon had built, the place where God's presence was said to dwell, the center of religious life for the people of Judah. The temple was not just a building. It was the physical manifestation of the covenant between God and the people. When the Babylonians set fire to it, when the cedar beams collapsed and the sacred vessels were carried away as plunder, it felt like the end of the world to those who believed in its sanctity. The smoke from the burning temple rose over Jerusalem, and with it rose questions that would haunt the exiles. How could this happen? Where was divine protection? What did this destruction mean for their relationship with God? The temple's destruction became the central trauma of the exile period, the event that demanded theological explanation and reinterpretation. Fact 7. The Babylonian exile begins. After the destruction, the Babylonians, like the Assyrians before them, deported the leadership of Judah. But this time, the experience would be different. The exiles were taken to Babylon, to the great cities of Mesopotamia, where they were settled in communities. They were not scattered and lost like the northern tribes had been. Instead, they remained together in significant numbers, maintaining their identity as Judeans, as people from Judah. They lived by the rivers of Babylon, and there they sat down and wept when they remembered Zion. The exile was a time of profound dislocation, a time when everything familiar was stripped away, the land, the temple, the political structures. Yet it was also a time of remarkable creativity, when new forms of religious practice emerged, when texts were compiled and edited, when the very concept of being Judean was reimagined for a people without a homeland. Fact 8. The loss of Davidic political rule. With the fall of Jerusalem, the dynasty of David came to an end as a ruling power. For over 400 years, descendants of King David had sat on the throne in Jerusalem. This continuity had been a source of legitimacy, a sign of God's promise to David that his line would endure forever. Now, the last Davidic king, Zedekiah, was captured, his sons killed before his eyes, and he himself was blinded and taken in chains to Babylon. The throne was empty. No Davidic king would rule again in any meaningful political sense for the rest of ancient history. This loss transformed the hope for a Davidic ruler into a future expectation, a messianic longing, rather than a present reality. The idea of kingship shifted from political fact to theological promise. Fact 9. The end of Israelite sovereignty. With both kingdoms fallen, with deportations completed, with cities destroyed, the long period of Israelite political independence came to an end. For centuries afterward, The people who traced their ancestry to the ancient kingdoms would live under foreign rule, first Babylonian, then Persian, then Greek, then Roman. They would have periods of limited autonomy, moments of rebellion, times when they managed their own local affairs, but never again in the ancient period would they have full sovereignty over their own land, their own destiny. This loss of independence became a defining feature of the Jewish historical experience, shaping how communities thought about power, about exile, about what it meant to survive as a people without a state. Fact 10. The birth of the idea of national catastrophe. Out of these events, the destructions, the exiles, the end of the kingdoms, a new concept emerged: the idea of national catastrophe as a defining historical moment. The fall of the kingdoms became more than just military defeat. It became a theological crisis, a moment that demanded explanation and memory. The prophets who had warned of destruction were vindicated, and their words were preserved. The texts that recorded these events were copied and recopied, studied and interpreted. The memory of the catastrophe became central to identity, woven into liturgy, into fast days, into stories told to children. The destruction of the temple would be mourned for generations. This was the birth of a historical consciousness that saw trauma not as something to forget, but as something to remember, to learn from, to carry forward as a warning and as a hope for eventual restoration. The catastrophe became the foundation for resilience, for a people who would survive by remembering. Let these moments settle now as you rest. The ancient past, with all its weight and sorrow, fades into the quiet of sleep. We continue now through the centuries following the fall of the kingdoms. Let yourself drift as we explore how a people learned to survive and even thrive far from home. These are 10 facts about exile, adaptation, and the transformation of identity. Fact 1. The Babylonian exile as the first organized diaspora. The Babylonian exile was unlike the scattered deportations that had befallen the northern kingdom. When the Judeans were taken to Babylon, they were settled in communities where they could live near one another, where families could stay together, where the bonds of kinship and shared memory could be maintained. This was the beginning of something new in human history, an organized diaspora. The exiles lived in settlements along canals, in neighborhoods within the great cities of Mesopotamia. They were able to gather, to share stories, to maintain their traditions. They were not absorbed immediately into the surrounding population. Instead, they formed distinct communities, recognized by both themselves and by the Babylonian authorities as Judeans, as people from Judah. This pattern, living as a distinct community within a larger foreign society, would become a defining feature of Jewish existence for millennia to come. The exile taught that physical displacement did not have to mean cultural disappearance, that identity could be portable, carried in texts and practices, rather than tied exclusively to territory. Fact 2. Jews maintain identity under foreign rule. In Babylon, far from Jerusalem, far from the temple that had been destroyed, the exiles faced a crucial question. How do you remain who you are when everything that defined you has been taken away? They found answers. They gathered on the Sabbath. They told their children the stories of Abraham and Moses. They remembered the laws that had been given at Sinai. Scribes began to collect and edit the text that would become the Hebrew Bible, writing down the histories, the prophecies, the laws, the poetry. New practices emerged: the reading of Torah in assemblies, prayer as a substitute for temple sacrifice, the observance of dietary laws as a marker of distinctiveness. The exile became a crucible in which Jewish identity was refined and redefined. It was no longer primarily about living in a particular land or worshipping at a particular temple. It became about shared texts, shared practices, shared memory. The exiles proved that it was possible to maintain a cohesive identity even while living under foreign rule, even while scattered across an empire. This resilience, this adaptability, would become one of the most remarkable features of Jewish historical survival. Fact 3. The year 538. BCE and the Persian conquest of Babylon. In 538 BCE, the world shifted once again. The Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, and with that conquest, the entire Babylonian Empire fell under Persian control. The Persians ruled differently than the Babylonians or Assyrians had. They governed through a system that allowed subject peoples a degree of local autonomy, that respected local customs and religions, that saw benefit in having stable, cooperative populations. For the Judean exiles, this change in imperial power brought unexpected opportunity. The harsh years of exile under Babylonian rule were coming to an end, though exile itself would persist in new forms. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a liberator in Persian propaganda, and his policies reflected a pragmatic tolerance. The shift from Babylonian to Persian rule marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which return to the homeland became possible, even if not all would choose to take that opportunity. Fact 4. Cyrus allows Jews to return. King Cyrus issued a decree that allowed the Judean exiles to return to their homeland. This edict, preserved in both biblical texts and in Persian records, gave permission for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and for the restoration of religious life there. It was a moment of hope, a reversal of fortune that seemed almost miraculous to those who had lived through the catastrophe. And yet, the reality was complex. Not all of the exiles returned. Many had built lives in Babylon, established businesses, raised children who had never known Judah. The land of their ancestors was now a distant memory, perhaps idealized, perhaps frightening in its unfamiliarity. Those who did choose to return faced a difficult journey and an uncertain future. They would be traveling to a ruined land, to cities that had been destroyed decades earlier, to a place where other peoples had settled in their absence. The permission to return was generous, but it was not a restoration of all that had been lost. It was a beginning, but one fraught with challenges. Fact 5. The Second Temple period begins. When the returnees arrived in Jerusalem, they set about rebuilding. The most important project was the construction of a new temple, a successor to Solomon's temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. This second temple would stand for nearly 6 centuries, and the entire era, from its construction until its eventual destruction, would be known as the Second Temple period. The new temple was more modest than the first had been. The old men who remembered Solomon's temple wept when they saw the foundation of the new one, so much smaller and less grand. Yet this second temple became the center of religious life once again. Sacrifices were offered, priests resumed their duties, pilgrims came for the festivals. The temple gave physical form to the restoration, to the idea that despite everything that had been lost, something essential could be rebuilt. It was a symbol of continuity, even in the midst of profound change. The Second Temple period would witness tremendous developments: the rise of new religious movements, the creation of synagogues, the canonization of sacred texts. debates about law and interpretation that would shape Judaism for all time to come. Fact 6. Judah, renamed Yehud. Under Persian rule, the former kingdom of Judah became a province called Yehud. It was a small territory, much reduced from the borders of the Old Kingdom, centered on Jerusalem and the surrounding hill country. Yehud was administered by Persian-appointed governors, some of whom were themselves Judeans, returnees from the exile. The province was integrated into the vast Persian administrative system, paying taxes to the empire, subject to imperial oversight. The name Yehud appears on coins, on official seals, in administrative documents, a bureaucratic designation for what had once been a proud kingdom. The territory was no longer politically independent, but it had a defined status within the empire, a recognized identity. The people living there were subjects of the Persian king, yet they were also members of a religious community with its own laws and customs, its own sense of collective identity. Yehud was both a Persian province and the homeland of a people whose identity transcended political boundaries. Fact 7. The term Jews emerges. During this period, a new term gained currency, Yehudim, which we translate as Jews. Originally, the word simply meant people of Judah, Judeans. But as the Second Temple period progressed, the meaning shifted and expanded. It came to refer not just to those who lived in the province of Yehud, but to all those who identified with the religious and cultural traditions centered on Jerusalem, whether they lived in the homeland or remained in Babylon, or had scattered to other parts of the Persian Empire. The term Jews became an identity marker that could travel, that could apply to communities living under different rulers, speaking different languages, occupying different social positions. It was both an ethnic designation and a religious one, tied to descent, but also to practice, to the observance of Torah, to the recognition of Jerusalem's temple as sacred. The emergence of this term reflected the new reality. Identity was no longer primarily about political citizenship in a kingdom, but about belonging to a people defined by shared tradition, shared text, shared memory. Fact 8. Persian imperial rule continues. The Persian Empire ruled the region for over 2 centuries. During all this time, Yehud remained a province within the imperial system. The Persians maintained control through their satrapy system, dividing their empire into large administrative regions, each governed by a satrap who answered to the king. Yehud was part of the satrapy called Beyond the River, which included all the lands west of the Euphrates. Persian rule was relatively stable, and the empire's policy of allowing religious and cultural autonomy meant that Jewish life could flourish within these structures. Yet it was always life under foreign domination. The ultimate authority rested not in Jerusalem, but in the distant Persian capitals. First Pasargadae, then Susa, then Persepolis. Taxes flowed east, tribute was paid, imperial edicts had to be obeyed. The Jews had their temple, their laws, their local leadership, but they did not have sovereignty. They lived as a subject people, dependent on the tolerance and policies of emperors who might change, whose successors might take a different view. Fact 9. Autonomy without independence. The Jewish community in Yehud experienced something that would become familiar in later centuries: autonomy without independence. They could govern their internal religious affairs, maintain their own courts for certain matters, collect their own communal funds, decide questions of religious law. The high priest in Jerusalem held significant authority, and scribes and sages interpreted the Torah and taught the people. In many ways, daily life could proceed as if the community were self-governing. But this autonomy existed only at the pleasure of the imperial power. It could be expanded or restricted depending on the political situation. It did not include the power to make war or peace, to control borders, to issue currency bearing the image of a Jewish king, to conduct independent foreign relations. It was a limited form of self-determination, real within its boundaries, but always contained within a larger structure of foreign control. This model, cultural and religious autonomy within a framework of political subordination, would recur throughout Jewish history, shaping strategies of survival and adaptation. Fact 10. Exile is no longer temporary. Perhaps the most significant shift during this period was psychological and communal. The exile, which had begun as a catastrophe, as a temporary displacement, that would surely end when God restored the fortunes of the people, gradually became permanent for many. The thriving Jewish communities in Babylon did not disappear when return became possible. They continued, growing larger and more established with each generation. Jews lived in Persian cities, in Egypt, in other parts of the Near East, and these diaspora communities became permanent features of Jewish life. The center in Jerusalem remained symbolically and religiously important, but it was no longer where most Jews lived. Exile was no longer a condition to be overcome, but a way of life to be navigated. The diaspora was not a punishment to be endured until redemption came, but a reality that required its own institutions, its own forms of community, its own relationship to the distant homeland. This acceptance transformed Jewish self-understanding. The people learned to be both rooted and mobile, to maintain connection to a sacred center while building lives in the wider world. The temporary displacement had become a permanent condition, and from that condition, new forms of Jewish life emerged. Rest now with these thoughts. The ancient past continues its slow unfolding, carrying us gently towards sleep. As you relax deeper into rest, we move forward through time to an age of new empires and new challenges. 10 facts now about adaptation, resistance, and the meeting of different worlds. Fact 1. Alexander the Great conquers the region. In the year 332 BCE, a young Macedonian king named Alexander swept through the ancient Near East with an army that seemed unstoppable. He had already conquered Greece, defeated the Persian Empire in a series of brilliant battles, and now he marched through Syria and down the coast toward Egypt. The land of Judea lay in his path. The Persian Empire, which had ruled for over 2 centuries, collapsed before Alexander's advance. Cities opened their gates rather than face siege. The transition happened with remarkable speed. Within a few years, the entire political landscape had been transformed. Alexander brought with him not just military conquest, but a vision of cultural unity, a dream of blending Greek and Eastern civilizations into something new. For the Jewish community living in and around Jerusalem, this conquest meant yet another shift in imperial masters, another adjustment to foreign rule. But Alexander's conquest would prove to be more than just a change of dynasty. It would introduce cultural forces that would challenge Jewish identity in profound ways, creating tensions that would persist for generations. Fact 2. Hellenistic rule replaces Persian rule. After Alexander's death, in 323 BCE, his empire fractured. His generals fought among themselves for control of different regions, and the unified empire split into several Hellenistic kingdoms. But even divided, these kingdoms shared something fundamental. They all promoted Greek culture, Greek language, Greek ways of thinking and living. This was Hellenism, the spread of Greek civilization throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The Hellenistic rulers built Greek-style cities with gymnasiums, theatres, and temples to Greek gods. They established Greek as the language of administration and culture. They brought Greek philosophy, Greek literature, Greek educational systems. For subject peoples like the Jews, this meant living under rulers who valued and promoted a culture very different from their own. The Persian rulers had been relatively indifferent to local customs. The Hellenistic rulers actively promoted Greek culture as superior, as the mark of civilization. This created pressure to adopt Greek ways, to speak Greek, to participate in Greek cultural institutions. The replacement of Persian rule with Hellenistic rule was not just a political change, it was a cultural confrontation that would define Jewish life for the next 2 centuries. Fact 3. Jewish life under the Ptolemies. After the wars of Alexander's successors settled, Judea came under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty, based in Egypt. The Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria, the great city that Alexander had founded on the Egyptian coast. They administered Judea as part of their larger empire, and for roughly a century, Jewish life continued under Ptolemaic oversight. The Ptolemaic rulers were generally tolerant of Jewish religious practices. They allowed the temple in Jerusalem to function, permitted the high priest to maintain authority over religious matters, and did not interfere excessively in internal Jewish affairs. Taxes were collected, officials were appointed, but daily life for most Jews continued much as it had under Persian rule. The Ptolemies were practical rulers, more interested in revenue and stability than in forcing cultural change. During this period, Jewish communities could practice their religion, maintain their traditions, and live according to a Torah law without facing systematic persecution. Yet even in this relatively peaceful time, Greek influence was growing. Greek language spread, Greek cultural practices became familiar, and some Jews began to adopt elements of Hellenistic culture, creating the first stirrings of tension between tradition and assimilation. Fact 4. Later Seleucid control. Around 200 BCE, control of Judea shifted from the Ptolemies to another Hellenistic dynasty, the Seleucids, who ruled from Syria. This transition came after a series of wars between the 2 kingdoms, and when the dust settled, Judea found itself within the Seleucid sphere. Initially, the change seemed minor. One set of Hellenistic rulers replaced another. Taxes continued to be paid. The temple continued to function. But the Seleucid rulers would prove to be more interventionist, more willing to interfere in Jewish internal affairs. As Seleucid power grew more unstable, as the dynasty faced military challenges and financial pressures, the kings became more desperate for resources and control. They began to appoint and remove high priests based on political considerations and payments, turning the sacred office into a commodity. This interference in religious leadership created factions within the Jewish community, with different groups supporting different candidates for high priest. The Seleucid period would ultimately bring crisis, as rulers moved from indirect control to active suppression of Jewish practices. But in the early decades of Seleucid rule, these troubles still lay ahead, barely visible on the horizon. Fact 5. The rise of Greek cultural influence. Throughout the Hellenistic period, Greek culture exercised a powerful attraction. Greek was the language of sophistication, of education, of advancement in the broader world. Young Jewish men from wealthy families learned to speak Greek fluently, read Greek literature, studied Greek philosophy. In Jerusalem and other cities, some Jews adopted Greek names, wore Greek clothing, participated in Greek athletic competitions. Gymnasiums were built where young men exercised naked in the Greek fashion, a practice that troubled traditionalists who saw it as immodest and as a rejection of Jewish distinctiveness. Greek ideas about the body, about knowledge, about the gods, about the nature of reality itself began to circulate within Jewish intellectual circles. Some Jews saw Hellenistic culture as compatible with their own traditions, finding ways to blend Torah study with Greek philosophical inquiry. Others viewed these developments with alarm, seeing in Hellenization a threat to everything that made Jewish identity distinct. The rise of Greek cultural influence created a spectrum of responses within the Jewish community, from enthusiastic adoption to fierce resistance, with many people occupying complex positions in between. Fact 6. Jewish resistance to forced Hellenization. The tension between Jewish tradition and Greek culture reached a breaking point in the 160s BCE, when the Seleucid king Antiochus, the fourth Epiphanes, attempted to force Hellenization upon the Jews. He issued decrees banning fundamental Jewish practices, circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary laws. He ordered the temple in Jerusalem to be rededicated to Zeus, and pigs were sacrificed on the altar, a deliberate desecration. Copies of Torah scrolls were burned. Jews who refused to abandon their practices faced execution. This was no longer cultural influence or voluntary adoption. This was religious persecution, an attempt to erase Jewish distinctiveness by force. The response was resistance. In the town of Modin, a priest named Mattathias refused to sacrifice to Greek gods and killed both the Jewish official who complied and the Seleucid officer overseeing the ceremony. This act of defiance sparked a revolt. Mattathias and his sons, particularly Judah the Maccabee, fled to the hills and began a guerrilla war against Seleucid forces. Jews who had been willing to accommodate some Greek influence now found themselves facing a choice: submit to forced assimilation or fight to preserve their religious identity. Many chose resistance, joining the Maccabean revolt that would eventually succeed in restoring Jewish control of the temple and winning a degree of independence. Fact 7. The Jewish community in Alexandria flourishes. While these tensions played out in Judea, something remarkable was happening in Alexandria, the great Ptolemaic capital in Egypt. A large Jewish community had grown there, eventually becoming one of the largest concentrations of Jews anywhere in the world. These Alexandrian Jews lived immersed in Hellenistic culture. They spoke Greek as their primary language. Many no longer understood Hebrew or Aramaic. They participated in the cultural and economic life of one of the world's great cities. Yet they maintained their Jewish identity, gathering in synagogues, observing Jewish festivals, maintaining dietary laws and other practices. The Alexandrian Jewish community proved that it was possible to be both thoroughly Hellenized and authentically Jewish. They produced scholars and philosophers who wrote in Greek about Jewish topics, who interpreted Torah using Greek philosophical methods, who engaged with the intellectual currents of their time while remaining committed to their ancestral traditions. The most famous of these would be Philo, who lived later, but the groundwork was laid in this period. Alexandria showed one possible future for Judaism: diaspora communities fully integrated into the cultures around them while maintaining distinct religious identity. Fact 8. The Septuagint, translated into Greek. The flourishing of the Alexandrian Jewish community produced one of the most important works in Jewish history, the Septuagint, a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. According to tradition, this translation was commissioned by the Ptolemaic king for his great library, and 72 Jewish scholars completed it in 72 days, each working independently, yet producing identical translations, a miracle attesting to its accuracy. The reality was likely less dramatic. The translation was probably done gradually, over many decades by different translators, for the practical reason that Alexandrian Jews needed to be able to read their scriptures in the language they actually spoke. But whatever its origins, the Septuagint was revolutionary. It made the Jewish scriptures accessible to anyone who could read Greek, which in the Hellenistic world meant educated people throughout the Mediterranean. It allowed diaspora Jews to remain connected to their sacred texts even when they had lost the ability to read Hebrew. It would later become the version of the Hebrew Bible used by early Christians, shaping the development of Christianity. The Septuagint demonstrated that sacred tradition could be translated, could adapt to new linguistic contexts, without losing its essential meaning. Fact 9. Diaspora culture expands. During the Hellenistic period, Jewish diaspora communities spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. There were Jewish communities in Greece, in Asia Minor, in Mesopotamia, in North Africa, on the islands of the Aegean Sea. Wherever Hellenistic trade networks reached, Jewish merchants and settlers followed. These diaspora communities maintained contact with Jerusalem. They sent the temple tax. They tried to go on pilgrimage when possible. They looked to Jerusalem for religious authority. But they also developed their own local institutions, their own synagogues, their own ways of negotiating life in diaspora. They created a model of Jewish life that did not depend on living in the land of Israel, that could flourish in foreign cities, that could adapt to local conditions while maintaining core identity. The expansion of diaspora culture meant that Judaism was becoming increasingly diverse, with communities living under different rulers, speaking different languages, facing different challenges, yet all recognizing themselves and each other as part of the same people. The center in Jerusalem remained important, but the Jewish world was becoming truly international. Fact 10. Identity preserved without sovereignty. Through all the changes of the Hellenistic period, conquests, cultural pressures, persecution, dispersion, Jewish identity survived without political sovereignty. There was no Jewish state for most of this period, no Jewish king, no independent control over territory or borders. Yet Jewish identity not only survived, but flourished and evolved. The community proved that it could maintain itself through religious practice, through shared texts and traditions, through communal institutions like the synagogue, through the bonds of peoplehood that transcended political boundaries. Whether in Jerusalem under foreign rulers, in Alexandria speaking Greek, in Babylon continuing the ancient exile communities, or in new settlements throughout the Hellenistic world, Jews maintained their distinctiveness. They found ways to be both particular and universal, to preserve ancient traditions while engaging with new ideas, to resist assimilation while participating in the wider culture. The preservation of identity, without sovereignty, became a defining characteristic of Jewish historical experience. It showed that a people could endure, could maintain continuity across generations and across vast distances, without the structures of statehood that other peoples considered essential to survival. Let these ancient struggles and adaptations fade now, as you drift toward sleep. The story continues in the silence of rest. Continue to relax as we journey through a remarkable period of rebellion and brief freedom. 10 facts about the struggle for independence and its complicated aftermath. Fact 1. Seleucid oppression sparks rebellion. The crisis began with Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who ruled from Syria. His empire was in financial difficulty, weakened by wars with Rome and internal instability, desperate for revenue and control. Antiochus looked to Judea and saw a province that was not fully integrated into Hellenistic culture, a people who maintained practices that set them apart. He decided to force the issue. His decrees grew increasingly harsh. Jews were forbidden to practice their religion, forbidden to circumcise their sons, forbidden to observe the Sabbath or keep dietary laws. The temple in Jerusalem was transformed into a shrine to Zeus Olympios, and pigs were sacrificed on its altar, an act designed to defile the holiest site in Judaism. Torah scrolls were seized and burned. Jews who resisted were executed, sometimes in horrific ways. Mothers who had circumcised their infants were killed along with their babies. This systematic oppression, this attempt to erase Jewish religious identity by force, created a situation that many Jews found intolerable. The oppression was not just political or economic. It struck at the heart of what it meant to be Jewish. It demanded not just obedience, but apostasy. And from this unbearable pressure, rebellion was born. Fact 2. The Maccabean Revolt begins in 167 BC. The spark came in the village of Modi'in, northwest of Jerusalem. A Seleucid official arrived to enforce the king's decrees, setting up an altar and demanding that the local Jews sacrifice to Greek gods. Mattathias, an elderly priest from the Hasmonean family, was called upon to perform the sacrifice first. As a man of standing in the community, he refused akad. When another Jew stepped forward to comply, Mattathias killed him on the spot, then killed the Seleucid official as well. It was an act of religious zealotry and political defiance, a moment when decades of accumulated frustration erupted into violence. Mattathias and his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judah, Eleazar, and Jonathan, fled into the hills. They called on others to join them, proclaiming, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." Those who came were not a professional army, but farmers, priests, craftsmen, people willing to fight and die rather than abandon their faith. Mattathias died soon after the revolt began, but leadership passed to his 3rd son, Judah, who would earn the nickname Maccabee, the hammer, for his fierce fighting style. The Maccabean Revolt had begun, a guerrilla war against one of the great powers of the age. Fact 3. Guerrilla warfare against the Seleucids. Judah Maccabee proved to be a brilliant guerrilla commander. He knew the hill country of Judea intimately, knew every path and hiding place. He used this knowledge to strike at Seleucid forces and their Jewish collaborators, then disappear before the enemy could respond. His forces were outnumbered and out-equipped, but they were motivated by religious fervor and desperation. They had no choice but to win. Defeat would mean not just death, but the end of Jewish religious practice. Judah's tactics avoided open battle when possible, preferring ambush, nighttime raids, attacks on supply lines. When Seleucid armies marched through the narrow passes of the hill country, the Maccabees attacked from the heights, rolling stones down on the soldiers below, then vanishing into the wilderness. Gradually, these tactics succeeded. Small Seleucid detachments were defeated, then larger forces. The rebellion gained momentum as more Jews joined, inspired by the victories. The Seleucid governors in the region found themselves unable to suppress the revolt. They called for reinforcements from Syria, for larger armies. But the Maccabees adapted to each challenge, using mobility and knowledge of terrain to offset the enemy's advantages in numbers and equipment. Fact 4. Rededication of the Temple. After 3 years of fighting, in December of 164 BCE, Judah Maccabee Al achieved what had seemed impossible. He captured Jerusalem and reclaimed the temple. The Seleucid garrison still held the Acra fortress in the city, but the Temple Mount itself was in Jewish hands. What Judah and his followers found in the temple was heartbreaking. The sacred space had been defiled, used for pagan worship, left in disarray. The eternal flame had gone out. Idols stood where the ark had once rested. The courtyards were overgrown with weeds. But now came the work of restoration. The altar was torn down and rebuilt with undefiled stones. The temple vessels were replaced. The priests purified themselves and the sacred spaces according to the laws of ritual purity. After the cleansing was complete, on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, exactly 3 years after its desecration, the temple was rededicated. Sacrifices were offered again, the menorah was lit, and the people celebrated for 8 days. This rededication, this restoration of the temple to proper worship, would be remembered ever after in the festival of Hanukkah, the festival of lights. It was a moment of triumph, of hope restored, proof that resistance was possible, that religious identity could be defended successfully against even powerful empires. Fact 5. The Hasmonean kingdom established. The military success continued. Judah Maccabee was killed in battle in 160 BCE, but his brothers Jonathan and then Simon continued the struggle. They proved to be skilled not just at warfare, but at diplomacy, playing Seleucid factions against each other as the empire descended into civil war. By 142 BCE, Simon had secured a treaty that effectively granted Jewish independence. He was recognized as high priest and ethnarch, leader of the nation. He expelled the last Seleucid garrison from Jerusalem. For the first time in over 4 centuries, there was an independent Jewish state. Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, succeeded him, and under his rule, the state expanded significantly. The family that had begun the revolt, the Hasmoneans, now ruled as a dynasty. They combined religious and political authority with the high priesthood and royal power united in one person. It was a new form of Jewish governance, different from the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah, shaped by the Hellenistic world in which it emerged. The Hasmonean kingdom would last for roughly 80 years, a brief window of sovereignty in the long history of foreign rule. Fact 6. First Jewish independence in centuries. The establishment of the Hasmonean kingdom marked the first time since 586 BCE that Jews controlled their own political destiny. There was no foreign governor to answer to, no distant emperor whose permission was needed to make decisions. The Hasmonean rulers minted their own coins, maintained their own army, conducted their own foreign policy. They negotiated with Rome, with the Seleucids, with the Ptolemies as independent actors, not as subjects. They determined internal policy without outside interference. For a people who had lived under Persian, Ptolemaic, and Seleucid rule for centuries, who who had maintained their identity without sovereignty. This independence was remarkable. It seemed to fulfill ancient prophecies, to vindicate the faith that had sustained the community through exile and oppression. Jews could live according to Torah law, not just as private individuals or as a tolerated community, but as the official policy of a state. The temple was not just permitted, but supported by state resources. Religious festivals were national celebrations. Independence allowed for a fullness of Jewish life that had not been possible under foreign rule, a chance to build a society entirely on Jewish terms. Fact 7. Expansion of Hasmonean rule. The Hasmonean rulers were not content with the small territory they initially controlled. John Hyrcanus and his successors embarked on campaigns of expansion, conquering neighboring territories and bringing them under Hasmonean rule. They pushed north into the Galilee, east across the Jordan, south into Idumea. At its greatest extent, the Hasmonean kingdom rivaled the old kingdoms of Israel and Judah in size, controlling most of the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, from the Galilee to the Negev. This expansion was partly motivated by security, creating buffer zones against hostile neighbors, and partly by opportunity, taking advantage of Seleucid weakness. But it also had a religious dimension. The Hasmoneans saw themselves as restoring the land to Jewish rule, reclaiming territories that had been part of the ancient kingdoms. They fortified cities, settled Jews in newly conquered areas, and asserted control over trade routes. The expansion brought wealth and power, but it also brought complications, as the kingdom now included many non-Jewish populations who had to be integrated or controlled, and as the kingdom's growing power attracted the attention of Rome, the rising superpower in the region. Fact 8. Forced conversions of the Idumeans. One of the most controversial policies of the Hasmonean rulers was their treatment of conquered populations, particularly the Idumeans in the south. Idumea, the land south of Judea, was inhabited by people descended partly from the ancient Edomites and partly from other groups that had settled there. When John Hyrcanus conquered Idumea around 110 BCE, he gave the Idumeans a choice: convert to Judaism or leave. This was forced conversion, something unprecedented in Jewish practice. Judaism had never been a missionary religion that sought converts by force. But the Hasmoneans, wielding state power and influenced by Hellenistic models of how conquerors dealt with subject peoples, decided that their expanded kingdom should be uniformly Jewish. Many Idumeans chose to convert rather than abandon their homes. They were circumcised, they adopted Jewish practices, they became legally and religiously Jews. Their descendants would be considered fully Jewish, including the Herodian family that would later rule Judea. But the method was troubling to many. It raised questions about the nature of Jewish identity. Could someone be forced to become Jewish? What did it mean when conversion came at the point of a sword rather than from genuine conviction? The forced conversions revealed how the possession of political power created ethical dilemmas that had not existed during the centuries of powerlessness. Fact 9. Internal, political, religious tensions. The Hasmonean kingdom, despite its military success, was plagued by internal tensions. Different groups within Jewish society had different visions of what the kingdom should be. The Pharisees emphasized careful observance of Torah law and oral traditions, and they questioned whether the Hasmoneans, who were not from the traditional Zadokite priestly line, had the right to serve as high priests. The Sadducees, drawn largely from the priestly aristocracy, supported the Hasmonean combination of political and religious authority. The Essenes rejected the temple establishment entirely, withdrawing to communities like Qumran where they could practice what they believed was purer Judaism. Some Jews felt the Hasmonean rulers had become too Hellenized themselves, adopting Greek names alongside their Hebrew ones, maintaining Greek-style courts, behaving more like Hellenistic kings than Jewish leaders faithful to tradition. There were disputes about who should succeed to rule when a ruler died, leading to civil wars between rival Hasmonean brothers. The unity that had existed during the revolt, when all factions joined against a common enemy, fractured during independence, as different groups competed for influence and as the contradictions in the Hasmonean project became apparent. Fact 10. Independence proves fragile. The independence that had been won through courage and blood proved unable to sustain itself. The internal divisions weakened the kingdom. In 67 BCE, a civil war broke out between two Hasmonean brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, each claiming the right to rule. Both sides sought foreign support for their claims. This was the fatal mistake. They appealed to Rome, the great power that now dominated the Mediterranean world. Rome had been content to leave Judea independent as long as the kingdom was stable and not a threat. But civil war, appeals for intervention, and the strategic location of Judea on the route to Egypt made it too important to ignore. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem, ostensibly to settle the dispute between the brothers. He entered the Holy of Holies in the temple, the sacred space that only the high priest could enter, an act of profound violation. When he emerged, he had made his decision, but his decision was that Rome would be in charge. The brief period of independence was over. The Hasmonean dynasty continued in diminished form for a while, but now as Roman clients, not independent rulers. The fragility of the independence was revealed. A small kingdom surrounded by great powers, divided internally, could not maintain sovereignty indefinitely. The window of freedom had closed. Rest now as these ancient struggles fade into the past. Let the rise and fall of kingdoms become distant echoes as sleep approaches. We arrive now at the final chapter of ancient Jewish independence. Let these 10 facts carry you deeper into rest as we witness the coming of Rome and the end of an era. Fact 1. The year 63 BCE and Pompey's conquest of Jerusalem. The Roman general Pompey the Great arrived in the region in 63 BCE. Fresh from victories in the east, he came to Syria as Rome extended its reach throughout the Mediterranean world, and he found Judea in the midst of civil war. 2 Hasmonean brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, were fighting for control, and both made the mistake of appealing to Rome for support. Pompey saw an opportunity. He marched his legions to Jerusalem, and when Aristobulus's supporters refused to surrender the city, Pompey laid siege to it. The siege lasted 3 months. Roman siege engines battered the walls. Roman soldiers filled in the ravines around the Temple Mount to bring their towers close. Finally, on a Sabbath day, when the defenders would not fight unless directly attacked, the Romans breached the walls. Thousands of Jews were killed in the fighting that followed. Pompey himself, curious about the famous temple, entered the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary where only the high priest could go, and only on Yom Kippur. He found no statue, no image of God, only an empty space, a concept foreign to Roman religious sensibilities. He took nothing from the temple, but his entry was itself a desecration. When he departed, Jerusalem remained standing, but Judea's brief independence was finished. Rome was now the master. Fact 2. Judea becomes a Roman client state. After Pompey's conquest, Judea was reorganized as a Roman client state. The Hasmonean dynasty continued in name, but now its rulers served at Rome's pleasure, holding power only as long as they remained useful to Roman interests. The territory was reduced. The coastal cities, the Greek cities of the Decapolis, and other regions were separated from Jewish control. Taxes now flowed to Rome. Roman governors in Syria exercised oversight. The high priesthood, once a sacred office passed down through generations, became a political appointment that could be granted or revoked by Roman authority. Judea retained a degree of internal autonomy. Jews could still practice their religion, maintain their own courts for religious matters, collect the temple tax, but all of this existed within the framework of Roman power. The legions were always there in the background, a reminder that ultimate authority rested not in Jerusalem, but in Rome. For a people who had so recently enjoyed independence, who had fought and died to throw off foreign rule, this return to subjection was bitter. The client-state arrangement meant living in a halfway condition, not fully independent, but not directly governed either, always dependent on the goodwill or indifference of Roman authorities. Fact 3. Herod the Great rules under Rome. In 37 BCE, Rome installed a new ruler in Judea, Herod, the son of an Idumean convert to Judaism. Herod was brilliant, ruthless, paranoid, and ambitious. He had allied himself with Rome at the right moment, backing Mark Antony, and then smoothly transferring his loyalty to Octavian when Octavian emerged victorious in Rome's civil wars. Rome rewarded Herod with the kingship of Judea, and he ruled for over 3 decades. Herod was a client king. His power derived entirely from Roman support, and he never forgot it. He maintained his position through a combination of political skill, building projects that impressed both his subjects and his Roman masters, and brutal suppression of any potential threats. He married a Hasmonean princess to gain legitimacy, then murdered her and other members of her family when he feared they might threaten him. He killed his own sons when paranoia convinced him they were plotting against him. Augustus Caesar reportedly joked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son, a dark pun, since as a Jew, Herod wouldn't eat pork. Despite his violence, or perhaps because of the stability it imposed, Judea prospered economically during Herod's reign, but he was never fully accepted by his subjects, who saw him as a foreign ruler imposed by Rome, an Idumean who had no legitimate claim to Jewish kingship. Fact 4. Massive rebuilding of the Second Temple. Herod's most ambitious project was the expansion and rebuilding of the Second Temple. The temple that had stood since the return from exile was modest, and Herod envisioned something grander, something that would rival the great temples of the Roman world and surpass the glory of Solomon's temple in memory. He began the project around 20 BCE, and though the main structure was completed in a few years, work continued for decades. The full complex would not be finished until 64 CE, just 6 years before its destruction. Herod doubled the size of the Temple Mount, building massive retaining walls and filling in the area behind them to create an enormous platform. The western wall of this platform, portions of which still stand today, gives some sense of the project's scale. Stones weighing dozens of tons, fitted together precisely without mortar. On this platform rose a temple of white stone and gold, gleaming in the sun, visible from miles away. The courts were vast, able to accommodate tens of thousands of pilgrims during festivals. Herod's temple became one of the architectural marvels of the ancient world. Yet for all its beauty, it remained a monument built by a king whom many Jews viewed as illegitimate, a symbol of the compromise with the Roman power that made such projects possible. Fact 5. Jewish resentment of Roman rule. Despite the prosperity of Herod's reign and the magnificence of his building projects, resentment against Roman rule simmered throughout Jewish society. The Romans demanded taxes, and tax collectors were often corrupt, extracting more than was owed and keeping the surplus. Roman governors and officials showed contempt for Jewish customs, sometimes deliberately provoking the population. When Pontius Pilate brought military standards bearing images of the emperor into Jerusalem, Jews saw it as an attempt to introduce idolatry into the holy city and protested until he removed them. The Romans required Jews to burn incense to the emperor, which many saw as blasphemous. There were constant small incidents, friction between occupiers and occupied. More deeply, many Jews felt that foreign rule itself was an offense, a violation of the covenant relationship with God. Various groups responded differently to this situation. The Pharisees focused on careful observance of the law within the constraints of occupation. The Sadducees, drawn from the priestly aristocracy, collaborated with Rome to maintain their privileged position. The Essenes withdrew to isolated communities, but increasingly there were those who believed that only armed resistance could end the occupation, that God would support those who fought for freedom. These groups, often called zealots or sicarii, carried out assassinations, attacked Roman officials, and preached rebellion. The resentment was building toward an explosion. Fact 6. The year 70 CE and the Great Jewish Revolt. The explosion came in 66 CE. After years of growing tension, after provocations by the Roman procurator Gessius Florus, after escalating violence in Jerusalem and other cities, the Jewish population rose in revolt. What began as riots became an organized rebellion. Jewish forces overwhelmed the Roman garrison in Jerusalem and defeated the Roman governor of Syria when he marched south with an army to restore order. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Jewish independence might be restored by force of arms. A revolutionary government was established. Coins were minted proclaiming the freedom of Zion, and different regions of Judea organized their defenses. But Rome could not allow a successful rebellion in such a strategic province. The Emperor Nero dispatched Vespasian with a large professional army. Vespasian systematically reconquered the Galilee and the outlying areas, crushing resistance village by village. When Nero died and Vespasian left to become emperor himself in 69 CE, his son Titus took command and marched on Jerusalem. In the spring of 70 CE, Titus laid siege to the city. Jerusalem's defenders fought with desperate courage, but they were trapped, surrounded by Roman legions, and divided among themselves by factional fighting. The siege lasted for months, and within the walls, people began to starve. Fact 7. Siege and destruction of Jerusalem. The siege of Jerusalem was a horror. The city was packed with refugees and pilgrims who had come for Passover and could not leave. Titus had his soldiers build a wall completely encircling Jerusalem to prevent anyone from escaping or any food from entering. Famine became severe. The historian Josephus, who witnessed these events, recorded terrible stories of starvation, of desperate people eating anything they could find, of social order breaking down. The defenders fought from behind 3 lines of walls, forcing the Romans to breach each one in turn. Roman siege engines hurled stones into the city. Battering rams weakened the walls. Soldiers dug tunnels, trying to undermine the defenses. Slowly, over months, the Romans advanced. They took the outer wall, then the second wall, and finally, in August, they breached the inner wall and stormed the Temple Mount. Fighting raged around the temple itself. Fire broke out. Whether started deliberately by the Romans or accidentally in the chaos is disputed, and the temple burned. The defenders made their last stand in the upper city, but by September, all resistance had been crushed. The Romans methodically destroyed what remained, tearing down walls, burning buildings, leaving Jerusalem a devastated ruin. The casualties were enormous. Josephus claimed over 1 million died, though modern historians consider this an exaggeration. Still, the death toll was certainly in the hundreds of thousands. Thousands more were enslaved and sent throughout the empire. Fact 8. The Second Temple destroyed. When the temple burned in 70 CE, it marked the end of an era in Jewish history. The Second Temple had stood for nearly 600 years, rebuilt after the return from Babylonian exile, expanded by Herod into a wonder of the ancient world. It was the center of Jewish religious life, the place where sacrifices were offered, where pilgrims came 3 times a year for the festivals, where the high priest entered the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. The temple was not just a building. It was the physical manifestation of God's presence among the people, the successor to the tabernacle that had traveled with the Israelites through the wilderness, the heir to Solomon's temple. Its destruction raised profound theological questions. Why had God allowed this to happen? What did it mean for the covenant? How could religious life continue without the temple, without sacrifices, without the rituals that the Torah commanded? Jewish religious teachers, particularly the Pharisees and their successors, the rabbis, began the work of reimagining Judaism for a world without a temple. Prayer would replace sacrifice. Study would become a form of worship. The home would become a small sanctuary. But in 70 CE, as the temple burned and the sacred vessels were carried off to Rome as plunder, the immediate feeling was one of catastrophic loss, of the world turned upside down. Fact 9. Fiscus Judaicus imposed on Jews. After the revolt was crushed, Rome imposed a special tax on all Jews throughout the empire, called the Fiscus Judaicus. Previously, Jews had paid a temple tax to support the temple in Jerusalem. Now, Vespasian decreed that this tax would continue to be collected, but it would go to Rome instead, specifically to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome. It was a humiliation, a reminder of defeat. Jews were forced to pay for the upkeep of a pagan temple, funding the worship of Roman gods. The tax was collected from every Jew, male and female, from age 3 to 62, throughout the empire. Roman authorities maintained registries of Jews to ensure compliance. The Fiscus Judaicus served multiple purposes. It generated revenue for Rome, it punished the Jewish population for the revolt, and it marked Jews as a distinct subordinate group within the empire. The tax would remain in effect for centuries, though later emperors would collect it less stringently. It was a constant reminder that the revolt had failed, that Jewish political aspirations had been crushed, that Jews lived at the sufferance of Rome. The tax turned Jewish identity itself into a source of regular tribute to the occupying power. Fact 10. Political autonomy shattered. The destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple shattered what remained of Jewish political autonomy. The revolutionary government was destroyed, its leaders killed or enslaved. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish council that had exercised religious and limited political authority, was dissolved. The high priesthood, which had continued in some form since the return from Babylonian exile, came to an end. There was no temple for a high priest to serve in. Judea was reorganized as a Roman province under direct imperial control, rather than being ruled through client kings. Roman governors held absolute power, and Roman law superseded Jewish law in all matters that concerned the state. Jews could still practice their religion, still maintain communal organizations, still regulate their own internal religious affairs, but there was no center of authority, no recognized leadership that spoke for all Jews, no political structure that could negotiate with Rome on behalf of the people. The limited autonomy that had existed under client kings, the carefully preserved privileges that had allowed a degree of self-governance, were swept away. In their place was direct occupation, military rule, and the clear understanding that any future resistance would be met with overwhelming force. The ancient dream of sovereignty, which had been briefly realized under the Hasmoneans, which had sustained the people through centuries of foreign rule, had to be fundamentally reconceived. Political power was no longer a realistic aspiration. Survival and religious continuity became the primary goals. Let these ancient sorrows dissolve into the peaceful darkness of sleep. The struggles of the past fade as rest embraces you. As you sink deeper into rest, we come to the final chapter of ancient Jewish presence in the land. 10 facts about one last desperate struggle and its consequences that would echo through the centuries. Fact 1. Continued resistance against Rome. Even after the devastation of 70 CE, even after the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple, resistance against Rome did not end. It could not end for many Jews, for whom foreign occupation remained intolerable. In the decades following the Great Revolt, there were scattered uprisings, acts of sabotage, assassinations of Roman officials and Jewish collaborators. These were not coordinated campaigns, but expressions of an enduring refusal to accept Roman rule as permanent. In 115 CE, major revolts broke out in Jewish communities across the diaspora, in Cyprus, in Egypt, in Cyrenaica, in North Africa, in Mesopotamia. These rebellions were brutally suppressed, with devastating losses to the Jewish populations in those regions. But in Judea itself, the spark of resistance remained alive, kept burning by those who remembered independence, who refused to accept that the story had ended, who believed that God would once again deliver the people if they proved their willingness to fight. The Romans maintained a heavy military presence in the province, but they could not extinguish the hope for freedom, the memory of what had been and might be again. This hope, combined with new provocations, would lead to one final desperate uprising. Fact 2. The Bar Kokhba Revolt erupts. In 132 CE, rebellion exploded across Judea once more. The immediate cause was the Roman Emperor Hadrian's plan to build a new Roman city on the ruins of Jerusalem, complete with a temple to Jupiter, on the site where the Jewish temple had stood. This was experienced as an unbearable desecration, a final erasure of Jewish claims to the holy city. At the same time, Hadrian issued an edict banning circumcision, which Jews saw as an attack on one of the most fundamental commandments. These provocations came after years of growing tension, after hopes that Hadrian might allow the temple to be rebuilt had been disappointed. The revolt was led by a man named Simon bar Kokhba, who many believed to be the Messiah. Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest scholars of the age, proclaimed him so, calling him Bar Kokhba, son of the star, a reference to the messianic prophecy in the book of Numbers. Bar Kokhba was a charismatic military leader who organized the rebellion with remarkable efficiency. Unlike the earlier revolt, this one began with careful planning, with stockpiling of weapons, with the digging of extensive networks of underground tunnels and hideouts throughout the Judean countryside. When the revolt erupted, it caught Rome by surprise. Fact 3. Organized guerrilla warfare. Bar Kokhba's forces initially achieved stunning success. They captured Jerusalem and held it. They established an independent Jewish state that lasted for over 2 years. Coins were minted proclaiming Year 1 of the redemption of Israel and for the freedom of Jerusalem. Bar Kokhba ruled as Nasi, prince, and attempted to restore something like normal life, including resuming sacrifices on the Temple Mount. But Bar Kokhba knew his forces could not defeat Rome in open battle. The Jewish fighters used guerrilla tactics, taking advantage of the mountainous terrain of Judea. They built an elaborate system of caves and tunnels, creating underground fortresses where they could hide, store supplies, and launch surprise attacks. Archaeological excavations have revealed these hiding complexes, narrow passages connecting caves, cisterns for water, storage rooms for food and weapons from these hidden bases. Jewish fighters would emerge to attack Roman patrols, disrupt supply lines, and then vanish back underground before Roman forces could respond. The guerrilla warfare was effective in the rugged hill country, allowing a smaller force to tie down larger Roman armies. But it required the support of the local population, and it could only delay, not prevent, Rome's eventual response. Fact 4. Roman legions crushed the rebellion. Rome could not tolerate another successful Jewish rebellion. Hadrian summoned his best general, Julius Severus, from Britain and assembled a massive military force, ultimately deploying 12 legions and numerous auxiliary units, perhaps 100,000 soldiers or more. This was one of the largest Roman military concentrations in any single province. Severus understood that he could not simply march to Jerusalem as Titus had done. The guerrilla tactics, the underground hideouts, the determined resistance required a different approach. So Severus adopted a strategy of systematic annihilation. His legions moved slowly through Judea, village by village, destroying everything. When they found a hiding complex, they sealed the entrances, trapping those inside to die of thirst and starvation. They burned fields so the rebels could not resupply. They besieged the fortified positions one by one, methodically reducing each stronghold. The fighting was brutal and prolonged, lasting 3.5 years. The Romans suffered significant casualties. Hadrian's report to the Senate notably omitted the traditional phrase, "I and the army are well," suggesting heavy losses. But Rome's resources were vastly greater. Slowly, inexorably, the rebellion was crushed. Bar Kokhba was killed in the final stand at Betah, southwest of Jerusalem, in 135 CE. The revolt was over. Fact 5. Mass death and enslavement. The Roman historian Cassius Dio recorded the scale of the destruction. 580,000 Jews killed in combat, in addition to those who died from starvation and disease. 50 fortified towns and 985 villages were destroyed. While these numbers may be exaggerated, they indicate a catastrophe of immense proportions. Archaeological evidence confirms the widespread destruction. Layers of ash and debris from this period, villages abandoned and never reoccupied, hiding complexes filled with the bones of those who died inside them. The surviving population was devastated. Tens of thousands were enslaved and sold in markets throughout the empire, so many that the price of slaves dropped dramatically. Entire communities ceased to exist. The landscape of Judea was depopulated, transformed by the systematic Roman campaign. The demographic impact was profound and lasting. While Jews continued to live in parts of the land, particularly in the Galilee to the north, which had been less affected by the fighting, the heartland of Jewish settlement in Judea was essentially emptied. The human cost of the Bar Kokhba Revolt exceeded even the losses of 70 CE. It was a tragedy that would be remembered as the final catastrophe of the ancient period, the end of Jewish political and military resistance to Rome. Fact 6. Judea, renamed Syria, Palestina. After crushing the revolt, Hadrian took steps to erase Jewish connection to the land. The province of Judea was officially renamed Syria Palestina, Philistine Syria. The name was deliberately chosen to invoke the Philistines, ancient enemies of the Israelites who had long since disappeared from history. By using this name, Rome was making a statement. Jewish historical claims to the land were being officially erased, replaced with a reference to a vanished enemy people. The renaming was part of a broader policy of de-Judaization. It was not just administrative reorganization, but an act of symbolic violence, an attempt to rewrite the very identity of the territory. Where maps and official documents had once read Judea, they now read Syria Palestina, or simply Palestina. The name would stick, eventually giving rise to the modern name Palestine. For Jews, forced to use Roman terminology or to hear their homeland referred to by this alien name, it was a constant reminder of defeat, of displacement, of Rome's determination to sever the Jewish people from their ancestral land. The renaming was intended to make Jewish sovereignty not just impossible, but unthinkable, to make it seem as if Jews had never truly belonged there at all. Fact 7. Jerusalem renamed Aelia Capitolina. Hadrian's plans for Jerusalem, which had sparked the revolt, were now implemented with savage irony. The city was rebuilt as a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina. Aelius was Hadrian's family name, and Capitolina referred to Jupiter Capitolinus, chief god of Rome. The new city was laid out on a Roman grid plan, with a forum, temples to Roman gods, baths, and all the amenities of a Roman provincial town. On the Temple Mount, where Solomon's temple and then the Second Temple had stood, where Jews had worshipped for 1,000 years, Hadrian built temples to Jupiter and Venus. Statues of Roman gods and emperors were erected throughout the city. The very topography was altered. Ruins were cleared, streets were rerouted. Roman monuments replaced Jewish ones. Aelia Capitolina was designed to be a Roman city with no trace of its Jewish past. No acknowledgement that this had been Jerusalem, the holy city, the center of Jewish religious life. The transformation was thorough and deliberate. Where David had established his capital 3,000 years before, where the Ark of the Covenant had rested, where pilgrims had come for festivals, there was now a city dedicated to Roman power and Roman gods. The renaming and rebuilding of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. Fact 8. Jews barred from Jerusalem. Hadrian issued a decree forbidding Jews from entering Aelia Capitolina. The penalty for a Jew found within the city was death. Only once a year, on the 9th of Avul, the anniversary of the temple's destruction, were Jews permitted to approach, not to enter the city, but to stand at a distance and mourn, to look at the ruins of the Temple Mount from afar. This annual day of mourning became institutionalized, a ritual of grief for what had been lost. For the rest of the year, the city that had been the center of Jewish religious life for a millennium was off limits. Jews who had grown up in Jerusalem, who had family buried there, who had memories of the temple before its destruction, could not return. The city of David, the city of the prophets, the city where the temple had stood, was now a place where Jews were forbidden to set foot. This ban would be enforced with varying degrees of strictness for centuries. Even when later Roman and then Byzantine emperors relaxed the prohibition slightly, Jerusalem remained essentially a Gentile city, its Jewish population minimal, its Jewish character erased. The prohibition from Jerusalem was not just a security measure, but a theological and political statement. Jewish claims to the city were null and void. The covenant relationship symbolized by the temple was finished. The land had been taken away. Fact 9. The center of Jewish life shifts abroad. With Judea devastated, Jerusalem forbidden, and the Jewish population of the land dramatically reduced, the center of Jewish religious and intellectual life shifted to the diaspora. The most important center became Babylonia, in Mesopotamia, far from Roman control. The Jewish community there, descended from those who had never returned from the ancient exile, was large, prosperous, and relatively undisturbed by the catastrophes that had befallen the homeland. In Babylonia, Jewish scholars continued the work of studying and interpreting Torah, developing what would become the Babylonian Talmud, the central text of Rabbinic Judaism. Another important center emerged in the Galilee, in the north of the land, which had been less affected by the Bar Kokhba Revolt. There, rabbinic academies preserved traditions, compiled the Mishnah, and maintained Jewish learning. But even these centers in the Galilee existed on sufferance, under Roman oversight, always vulnerable. The primary reality of Jewish life had fundamentally shifted. The diaspora was no longer peripheral to a center in Jerusalem. The diaspora itself had become the center, or rather, Jewish life now had multiple centers, none of them politically independent, all of them existing within the territories of foreign empires. The shift was not chosen, but forced by circumstances. Yet Jewish life adapted, creating new institutions, new forms of authority, new ways of maintaining identity without territory or political power. Fact 10. Diaspora becomes permanent. After the Bar Kokhba Revolt, the diaspora ceased to be a temporary condition awaiting remedy and became the permanent state of Jewish existence. The hope for restoration, for return to the land, for the rebuilding of the temple did not disappear. It remained central to Jewish prayer and belief, articulated in liturgy, in messianic expectation, in the daily hope that somehow, someday, God would bring the people home. But the realistic possibility of achieving this through political or military means was gone. Jews would live scattered across the known world, minority communities in Christian and later Muslim lands, maintaining their identity through other means, through text and tradition, through communal institutions like the synagogue and the rabbinic court, through the bonds of peoplehood that transcended national boundaries. The permanent diaspora required a reimagining of what it meant to be Jewish. Judaism adapted from a religion centered on temple sacrifice in a specific land to a religion based on study, prayer, and practice that could be maintained anywhere. Jewish identity became portable, carried in books rather than bounded by borders, expressed in communities rather than in kingdoms. The permanence of diaspora became a defining feature of Jewish existence, lasting not just decades or centuries but millennia. The door that had closed in 135 CE would not reopen in any meaningful political sense for nearly 2,000 years. Yet through all that time, Jews maintained their distinct identity, their connection to the land that had been lost, their memory of sovereignty, their hope for eventual restoration. The permanence of exile paradoxically ensured the permanence of Jewish survival. Let these ancient memories settle into silence now. The long story of loss and endurance fades as sleep gently takes you. Rest well. Continue to rest as we journey through the long centuries of diaspora. 10 facts about how a people survived and thrived without political power, building a civilization of the spirit. Fact 1. Development of Rabbinic Judaism. In the centuries following the destruction of the temple and the failed revolts, a new form of Judaism emerged from the crisis. This was Rabbinic Judaism, developed by the scholars known as rabbis, teachers who were the successors of the Pharisees. These rabbis faced an enormous challenge: how to preserve Jewish religious life when the temple was gone, when sacrifices could no longer be offered, when the priesthood no longer functioned, when the people were scattered across many lands. Their response was revolutionary. They taught that prayer could replace sacrifice, that study of Torah was itself an act of worship, that the home could become a small sanctuary, that the table where families shared meals could be as holy as the temple altar. The rabbis collected all traditions that had been passed down for generations, debating and codifying them into texts. They created academies of learning where these traditions were studied and elaborated. They developed methods of legal reasoning that could address new situations not explicitly covered in scripture. Through their work, Judaism was transformed from a religion centered on temple ritual in one specific place to a religion that could be practiced anywhere, that required no priesthood or sacrifice, only a community and a commitment to study and observance. Rabbinic Judaism became the foundation of all later Jewish practice, the form of Judaism that would survive through centuries of dispersion. Fact 2. Synagogues replaced the temple. With the temple gone, the synagogue, which had existed before the destruction but had been secondary to the temple, became the center of Jewish communal life. The word synagogue comes from Greek, meaning gathering place, and that is precisely what it was: a place where Jews could gather for prayer, for study, for community decisions. Synagogues could be established anywhere a community existed, requiring no priesthood, no specific genealogy, just a quorum of 10 adult Jewish men. Inside the synagogue, the focus was on the Torah scroll, kept in an ark that faced toward Jerusalem. Services consisted of prayers, readings from the Torah and the prophets, and interpretations by learned community members. The synagogue served multiple functions: house of worship, house of study, and house of assembly for communal governance. Every Jewish community, no matter how small or remote, could create this sacred space. In a sense, the synagogue made Judaism portable, allowing the religion to travel with the people rather than being fixed to one location. The multiplication of synagogues across the diaspora meant that Jewish religious life could flourish in countless locations simultaneously, that Jerusalem could be remembered and honored without being physically accessible, that the loss of the temple, devastating as it was, need not mean the end of Jewish worship. Fact 3. Torah and Talmud become central. In the absence of temple and homeland, text became the territory that Jews inhabited. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, had always been central, but now it became the primary focus of Jewish life. Every community needed a Torah scroll, carefully handwritten by trained scribes, treated with reverence, read publicly on a fixed schedule. But beyond the written Torah, there was also oral tradition, the accumulated interpretations and applications of biblical law that rabbis had been developing for centuries. This oral tradition was finally written down, first in the Mishnah, compiled around 200 CE by Rabbi Judah the Prince, which organized Jewish law by topic: agricultural laws, festival observance, marriage and divorce, civil and criminal law, ritual purity. Then came the Gemara, centuries of rabbinic discussion and elaboration on the Mishnah. Together, the Mishnah and Gemara form the Talmud. There are 2 versions: the Jerusalem Talmud and the larger, more influential Babylonian Talmud. The Talmud is vast, covering thousands of pages, filled with legal arguments, stories, ethical teachings, and digressions on every imaginable topic. It became the curriculum for Jewish education, the subject of lifelong study, the framework for Jewish thought. To be a learned Jew meant to know Talmud, to be able to follow its intricate arguments, to apply its principles to new situations. Text became homeland, study became the highest form of religious practice, and the page of Talmud became the space where Jews dwelt. Fact 4. Dina de Malchuta Dina, principle. Living as minorities in lands ruled by others, Jews needed a principle that would allow them to maintain their religious distinctiveness while functioning as loyal subjects of non-Jewish rulers. This principle was articulated in Aramaic as Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the kingdom is law. It meant that Jews were obligated to obey the civil laws of whatever country they lived in, to pay taxes to non-Jewish rulers, to accept the authority of Gentile courts in matters of state. This was not absolute. If a law required Jews to violate fundamental religious principles, then it should be resisted. But for ordinary matters of civil governance, the secular authority was to be respected. This principle served multiple purposes. It made Jewish communities acceptable to their rulers, demonstrating that Jews could be loyal subjects despite their religious differences. It allowed Jews to participate in economic and social life without constant conflict between religious law and state law. And it reflected the theological reality that sovereignty rested with God, that earthly kingdoms rose and fell, that Jews could maintain their identity under any ruler, because political power was ultimately temporary and subordinate to divine authority. The principle, Dina de Malchuta Dina, became a cornerstone of Jewish political thought throughout the diaspora period, a strategy for survival in lands where Jews held no power. Fact 5. The Exarch leads Babylonian Jews. In Babylonia, which remained the largest and most important Jewish community for many centuries, a unique form of Jewish leadership emerged, the Exarch, or Resh Galuta in Aramaic, meaning head of the exile. The Exarch claimed descent from the royal line of David and served as the political representative of the Jewish community to the non-Jewish rulers. First the Parthian kings, then the Sasanian Persian emperors, and later the Muslim caliphs. The Exilarch held significant authority. He appointed judges, collected taxes from the Jewish community, maintained order, and represented Jewish interests at the imperial court. He lived with considerable pomp, maintaining a court with advisors and officials, and the position was hereditary, passing from father to son within families that claimed Davidic ancestry. The Exilarch worked alongside the Geonim, the heads of the great rabbinical academies in Babylonia, creating a dual leadership structure. The Exilarch handling political and administrative matters, the Geonim handling religious and legal questions. This system allowed the Babylonian Jewish community to maintain a high degree of internal autonomy, to govern its own affairs according to Jewish law, while remaining integrated into the larger society. The institution of the Exilarch lasted for over 1,000 years, finally declining as the Babylonian community itself diminished in importance during the medieval period. Fact 6. Kehillah self-governance in Europe. In medieval Europe, Jewish communities developed their own form of self-governance called the Kehillah or Kahal. Each Jewish community elected or appointed leaders who handled internal affairs, collecting taxes that the community owed to the ruler, maintaining the synagogue and ritual bath, supporting the poor, adjudicating disputes according to Jewish law, regulating economic activities, and overseeing education. The Kehillah had the power to enforce its decisions through various means, including the ultimate sanction of herem, excommunication, which meant exclusion from the community and its services. Since Jews depended on their communities for religious services, social connection, and often for economic opportunities, herem was a severe punishment that gave communal authorities real power. European rulers generally granted Jews the right to manage their own internal affairs, seeing benefit in dealing with the Kehillah leadership, rather than with individual Jews. This autonomy meant that Jewish communities were essentially self-governing in religious and civil matters, living according to Jewish law, even while residing in Christian lands. The Kehillah system allowed European Jews to maintain their distinct identity, to preserve their traditions and practices, to educate their children in Jewish learning, and to support members in need. It was a form of governance without territory, authority without sovereignty, creating ordered communities held together by shared identity and mutual obligation rather than by state power. Fact 7. Jewish languages emerge, Yiddish and Ladino. As Jewish communities settled in different regions and remained there for generations, they developed their own languages, blending Hebrew with local vernaculars. In Central and Eastern Europe, Jews spoke Yiddish, a language that combined Hebrew with medieval German and Slavic elements, written in Hebrew characters. Yiddish became the daily language of millions of Jews, the language of the marketplace and the home, while Hebrew remained the language of prayer and sacred study. Yiddish had its own rich literature, folk tales, religious stories, eventually poetry and theatre and novels. It was a language that carried Jewish culture, that encoded Jewish experience in Europe, that could express shades of meaning specific to Jewish life. In the Iberian Peninsula and later throughout the Mediterranean world, after the expulsion from Spain, Jews spoke Ladino, also called Judeo-Spanish, which combined Hebrew with medieval Spanish. Like Yiddish, Ladino was written in Hebrew characters and developed its own literary tradition, its own songs and sayings, its own distinctive flavor. These Jewish languages allowed communities to maintain cohesion across generations, to transmit culture and values, to create a sense of shared identity, that transcended the particular countries where Jews lived. A Yiddish speaker from Poland could communicate with a Yiddish speaker from Germany, despite never having left their home regions. The languages were markers of Jewish distinctiveness, vehicles of cultural continuity, and practical tools for daily life in diaspora. Fact 8. Trade networks span continents. Without access to land ownership in many places, restricted from various professions and guilds, Jews often turned to trade and commerce. Jewish merchants developed networks that spanned vast distances, connecting communities across Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and eventually extending to India and China. These networks were based on family connections, on shared language and religious identity, on trust built through common heritage. A Jewish merchant in Cairo could send a letter of credit to a Jewish merchant in Baghdad or Venice, confident it would be honored. Jewish traders dealt in everything: spices and silks, books and manuscripts, precious metals, textiles, wine, grain. They served as intermediaries between Christian Europe and the Muslim world, able to operate in both spheres when direct contact between them was difficult. The Rabbinites, Jewish merchants of the early medieval period, traveled routes from France to China, speaking multiple languages, knowing local customs, carrying goods and information across political and religious boundaries. These trade networks brought economic success to some Jewish communities and individuals, but they also served a larger purpose. They connected far-flung Jewish communities, allowing for the exchange not just of goods, but of ideas, religious responsa, news of persecutions or opportunities. Trade networks helped maintain Jewish cohesion across vast distances, creating economic interdependence that reinforced cultural and religious bonds. Fact 9. Cultural survival without armies. Throughout the long centuries of powerlessness, Jews survived culturally without the tools that other peoples used. No armies to defend borders, no state to enforce cohesion, no territory to unify them. Instead, survival depended on other factors: the strength of religious commitment, the bonds of community, the transmission of tradition from generation to generation, the authority of text and law, the network of connections between distant communities. Jewish culture survived through education, the near universal literacy among Jewish males, achieved through religious education that taught every boy to read Hebrew so he could pray and study. It survived through ritual, the weekly Sabbath that structured time, the annual cycle of festivals that connected communities to their history, the life cycle ceremonies that marked birth, maturity, marriage, and death. It survived through law, the halacha that governed behavior, creating a shared framework of practice that made Jews recognizable to each other across vast distances. It survived through memory, the constant recollection of the past, the stories of Exodus and exile, the remembrance of Jerusalem. Cultural survival without political power required different strategies, different institutions, different forms of authority. It meant investing in education rather than weapons, in books rather than fortifications, in communal solidarity rather than military alliances. And remarkably, these strategies succeeded. Jewish culture not only survived but flourished, producing scholars and poets, legal experts and mystics, physicians and philosophers, all while living as minorities without state protection. Fact 10. Hope of return preserved in prayer. Despite the permanence of exile, despite centuries passing without any realistic prospect of return, Jews never abandoned the hope of restoration. This hope was woven into daily life through prayer. 3 times a day, Jews prayed facing Jerusalem, asking God to rebuild the city, to restore the temple, to gather the exiles from the four corners of the earth. The Amidah, the central prayer of every service, contained multiple references to return and restoration. Every Passover Seder concluded with the words, "Next year in Jerusalem." Every wedding ceremony ended with the breaking of a glass in remembrance of the temple's destruction. The 9th of Elul, the anniversary of both temples' destruction, was observed as a fast day of mourning. This constant liturgical remembrance kept the connection to the land alive across generations who had never seen it, who had no living memory of sovereignty, who knew Jerusalem only from texts and prayers. The hope was not primarily political, it was religious, messianic, awaiting divine intervention rather than human action. But it preserved something essential, the idea that exile was not the final state, that the story was not finished, that one day, somehow, there would be restoration. This hope gave meaning to suffering, purpose to endurance. It maintained the identity of Jews as a people connected to a specific land, even when that land was inaccessible and ruled by others. The preservation of hope through prayer was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of diaspora survival, keeping alive an aspiration that seemed impossible, maintaining a connection to a place that could not be reached, for century after century after century. Let these strategies of survival, these adaptations to powerlessness, fade gently now into the quiet of sleep. The long centuries of diaspora dissolve into peaceful rest. As you continue to rest, we move through darker centuries, through times of suffering and displacement. Let these 10 facts about persecution flow past you gently, their sharp edges softened by time and by the peace of sleep. Fact 1. Crusader massacres of 1096 to 1099. In 1096, Pope Urban II called for a crusade to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Tens of thousands of Christians across Europe took up the cross, preparing to march east to Jerusalem. But before the Crusaders even left Europe, violence erupted against Jewish communities along the Rhine River in Germany. Crusading armies and local mobs, inflamed by religious fervor and seeing Jews as enemies of Christianity living in their midst, attacked the Jewish quarters of cities like Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. Thousands of Jews were killed. Some were offered the choice of baptism or death. Many chose death rather than conversion. Entire communities were destroyed in a matter of days. Mothers killed their own children rather than see them forcibly converted. The massacres were documented by Jewish chroniclers who survived, their accounts filled with grief and incomprehension at the sudden explosion of violence. These were not communities living in remote areas or in constant conflict with their neighbors. These were established Jewish communities that had existed for centuries, that had contributed to their city's economic and cultural life. The Crusader massacres of 1096 traumatized European Jewry, creating a deep sense of vulnerability. They demonstrated that legal protections could vanish overnight, that Christian theology could be weaponized against Jews, that survival in Europe was always precarious. The massacres were repeated with subsequent crusades, making the crusading era one of sustained terror for European Jewish communities. Fact 2. Expulsion from England in 1290. In 1290, King Edward I of England issued an edict expelling all Jews from the kingdom. This was the first national expulsion of Jews from a European country, setting a precedent that would be followed elsewhere. Jews had lived in England since the Norman conquest in 1066, serving as moneylenders and merchants, providing financial services that Christians were forbidden by their own laws to perform. But over time, resentment grew. The church preached against Jewish money lending, portraying Jews as exploiters. Kings borrowed heavily from Jewish financiers, then found it politically convenient to expel them rather than repay debts. Blood libels, false accusations that Jews murdered Christian children for ritual purposes led to violence and executions. By 1290, the Jewish community in England numbered only a few thousand, already diminished by earlier persecutions and heavy taxation. When the expulsion order came, Jews had to leave by All Saints' Day, taking only what they could carry, abandoning homes and properties. Ships carried them across the Channel to France and other lands. England would remain without an officially recognized Jewish community for over 350 years, until Oliver Cromwell quietly allowed Jews to return in the 1650s. The expulsion demonstrated how vulnerable Jewish communities were to royal whim, how centuries of residence and contribution to society offered no security against sudden banishment. It was a wound in Anglo-Jewish history, a severance that lasted for generations. Fact 3. Expulsions from France. France expelled its Jewish population not once, but multiple times during the medieval period, creating a cycle of banishment and return that left communities in constant uncertainty. The first major expulsion came in 1182 under King Philip Augustus, who seized Jewish property and expelled Jews from the royal domain. Some returned when policies changed under later rulers. In 1306, King Philip IV ordered a comprehensive expulsion of all Jews from France, seizing their assets to fill his depleted treasury. About 100,000 Jews were forced to leave, scattering to neighboring lands. Within a few years, some were allowed to return, as the French economy suffered from their absence. But in 1394, another expulsion order was issued, this time permanent. Jews fled to the papal territories in southern France, to Germany, to Spain, to Italy, anywhere that would accept refugees. Each expulsion meant loss of homes, of livelihoods, of community ties built over generations. Families were separated, as some members had converted to Christianity to avoid expulsion, while others refused. Sacred books and Torah scrolls had to be carried into exile or hidden. The repeated expulsions from France created a population of wandering Jews, families that had been uprooted multiple times within a few generations, who learned to hold their possessions lightly, always prepared for the next displacement. The instability undermined the possibility of long-term planning, of building institutions that could span generations, of feeling genuinely settled anywhere. Fact 4. Spanish expulsion of 1492. The largest and most consequential medieval expulsion came in 1492, when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain issued an edict ordering all Jews to convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom within 4 months. The Jewish community in Spain, known as Sephardim, was one of the oldest and most culturally sophisticated in Europe. Jews had lived in Iberia since Roman times, over a millennium. Under Muslim rule, they had flourished during a golden age of Jewish philosophy, poetry, and learning. Even under Christian rule, Spanish Jews had contributed significantly to society as physicians, scholars, translators, tax collectors, and advisors to kings. But the Reconquista, the Christian conquest of Muslim territories in Iberia, brought increasing pressure on religious minorities. The Inquisition, established in 1478 to root out insincere converts from Judaism, created an atmosphere of suspicion and terror. In 1492, after the final Muslim kingdom of Granada fell, Ferdinand and Isabella decided to create religious uniformity in their realm. Between 40,000 and 100,000 Jews chose conversion to remain in Spain, but the majority, perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 people, chose exile rather than abandon their faith. They left behind homes, businesses, synagogues, cemeteries, everything but what they could carry. Some went to Portugal, only to be expelled from there 5 years later. Others went to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire, to Italy, to the Netherlands. The Spanish expulsion dispersed Sephardic culture throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The exiles carried with them the Ladino language, their distinctive religious customs, their memories of Spain. Many families preserved the keys to their Spanish homes for generations, symbols of a past they could not forget and a home they could not return to. Fact 5. Portuguese expulsion of 1497. Many Spanish Jews who fled to Portugal in 1492, hoping to find refuge there, faced yet another catastrophe just 5 years later. King Manuel I of Portugal issued an expulsion order in 1497, but with a particularly cruel twist. Rather than simply expelling Jews, Manuel had Jewish children forcibly baptized and taken from their families. The children were raised as Christians, often never seeing their parents again. Adult Jews were also pressured to convert through various means. Some submitted to forced baptism rather than leave. Others managed to flee, joining the Spanish exiles in the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, or other lands. Those who converted, whether voluntarily or under duress, became known as conversos or new Christians. But many continued to practice Judaism in secret, maintaining Jewish rituals in hidden ways, passing traditions quietly from generation to generation. These crypto-Jews, or Marranos, as they were disparagingly called, lived in constant danger. The Inquisition pursued them relentlessly, looking for signs of Jewish practice. Someone who avoided pork, someone who changed linens on Friday, someone who was seen not working on Saturday. Those caught faced torture, confiscation of property, and often death by burning. The Portuguese expulsion created a population of secret Jews who maintained their identity under conditions of extreme oppression, never knowing whom to trust, always fearing exposure, yet somehow keeping alive the spark of Jewish identity through centuries of persecution. Fact 6. Ghettos imposed in Europe. Beginning in the 16th century, many European cities began confining their Jewish populations to designated areas called ghettos. The first mandatory ghetto was established in Venice in 1516 on an island called the Ghetto Nuovo. The word ghetto itself came from the Venetian term for a foundry that had previously occupied the site. Jews were required to live within the ghetto's walls, which were locked at night and guarded. They could leave during the day for work, but had to return by curfew. The ghetto in Venice set a pattern that spread throughout Italy, and then to other parts of Europe. Ghettos were typically overcrowded as the Jewish population grew, but the designated area remained fixed. Buildings rose higher and higher as families added floors to create more living space. The streets were narrow and dark, sanitation was poor, and disease spread easily in the cramped conditions. Yet within the ghettos, Jewish communal life flourished in its own way. The Kahila governed internal affairs, synagogues and study houses operated, Jewish schools educated children, Kosher butchers and bakers served the community. The ghetto walls that confined Jews also protected them from some forms of outside violence. But the ghetto was fundamentally a form of segregation and control, a visible mark of Jewish inferiority and separateness. It limited economic opportunities, restricted movement, and created a physical barrier between Jews and their neighbors. The ghetto became a symbol of Jewish oppression in Christian Europe, a way of containing and controlling a population considered foreign and dangerous, tolerated but never fully accepted. Fact 7. Dhimmi status in Islamic lands. In the Islamic world, Jews and Christians were classified as dhimmis, protected peoples who were allowed to practice their religions but had inferior legal status compared to Muslims. This system was formalized in the Pact of Umar, a set of regulations dating from the early centuries of Islam. Dhimmis paid special taxes, the jizya and the kharaj, in exchange for protection and the right to worship. They faced various restrictions. They could not bear arms, could not testify against Muslims in court, had to wear distinctive clothing to identify themselves, could not build houses higher than Muslim homes or synagogues taller than mosques. In practice, the application of dhimmi rules varied greatly depending on time and place. Some Muslim rulers were relatively tolerant, allowing Jews to prosper and contribute to society. Under the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, under the Umayyads in Spain, under the Ottomans, Jews often achieved positions of influence and enjoyed cultural flowering. But in other times and places, the restrictions were harsh, enforced with rigor, supplemented with additional humiliations. The dhimmi system created a framework in which Jews could survive, but always as subordinate, always reminded of their inferior status, always dependent on the tolerance of Muslim rulers that could be withdrawn. It was better than the periodic expulsions and massacres of Christian Europe in many respects, but it was still a system of institutionalized inequality, ensuring that Jews could never be equal citizens in the lands where they lived. Fact 8. The Pale of Settlement confines Jews. In the Russian Empire, from 1791 until 1917, Jews were restricted to living in a region called the Pale of Settlement. This was a large area on the western edge of the empire, including parts of present-day Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. But it was still only a fraction of Russian territory. Jews were generally forbidden from living in interior Russia. Moscow, St. Petersburg, and most of the Russian heartland were off-limits, except for certain privileged categories like wealthy merchants, university students, and skilled craftsmen who could obtain special permits. Within the Pale, Jews faced additional restrictions, limits on where they could own land, restrictions on certain occupations, quotas on how many Jewish children could attend schools. The Pale became densely populated, with millions of Jews crowded into towns and cities, competing for limited economic opportunities. Small Jewish villages called shtetls dotted the landscape, centers of traditional Jewish life, but also places of poverty and vulnerability. The Pale of Settlement policy created a massive concentration of Jewish population in a limited area, easy to control and easy to target. It prevented Jews from integrating into Russian society, kept them economically marginalized, and made them perpetual foreigners in the empire, even though many families had lived there for centuries. The Pale was not just a geographic restriction, but a comprehensive system of discrimination that touched every aspect of Jewish life in Russia. Fact 9. Pogroms in Eastern Europe. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Jewish communities in the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe faced periodic outbreaks of violence called pogroms, a Russian word meaning to wreak havoc. These were organized or semi-organized attacks on Jewish communities, involving mobs that would descend on Jewish neighborhoods, destroying homes and businesses, beating and killing residents, assaulting women, looting property. The first major wave came in 1881 to 1884, following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, when Jews were scapegoated for Russia's problems. Another wave occurred in 1903 to 1906, including the notorious Kishinev pogrom, where dozens were killed. During and after the Russian Revolution and Civil War, from 1918 to 1921, massive pogroms swept through Ukraine and other regions, killing tens of thousands. The pogroms occurred with the tacit approval or active encouragement of authorities, or at minimum with their indifference. Police and soldiers often stood by watching or even participating. Jews were defenseless, as they were forbidden to bear arms and had no legal recourse against their attackers. The pogroms created an atmosphere of constant fear and insecurity. Families never knew when violence might erupt, when a rumor or an accusation might spark a mob. The pogroms drove millions of Jews to emigrate from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, to America, to Palestine, anywhere that promised greater safety. They demonstrated that even in the modern era, even with the supposed progress of civilization, Jewish life in exile remained precarious, subject to sudden violence from which there was no protection. Fact 10. Exile seen as unbearable. By the late 19th century, after centuries of persecution, expulsion, discrimination, and violence, many Jews had come to see the condition of exile as unsustainable. The optimism of the Enlightenment, the hope that legal emancipation and integration into European society would end Jewish suffering, had been challenged by continued anti-Semitism, even in countries that had granted Jews citizenship and civil rights. The Dreyfus Affair in France, where a Jewish army captain was falsely convicted of treason amid an outpouring of anti-Semitic hatred, showed that even in the most enlightened nations, Jews could become scapegoats. The pogroms in Russia, the persistence of the ghetto mentality, even where ghetto walls had fallen, the quotas and restrictions that limited Jewish advancement, all contributed to a sense that exile itself was the problem, that no amount of adaptation or achievement could make Jews truly safe in lands where they were minorities. This realization led different Jews to different conclusions. Some argued for migration to America, where they hoped democratic ideals would offer better protection. Some embraced socialism or communism, believing that class revolution would eliminate ethnic hatred. Others concluded that only a return to the ancestral homeland, only the creation of a Jewish state where Jews would be the majority and control their own destiny, could end the vulnerability of exile. The experience of centuries had taught that life without power, without sovereignty, without a territory to call their own, left Jews perpetually at risk. The unbearability of exile became a driving force for movements seeking to fundamentally change the Jewish condition. Let these heavy memories settle now, their weight dissolving as you drift deeper into rest. The sorrows of centuries past fade into the peaceful darkness of sleep. Continue your rest as we move into the modern era. 10 facts about how new freedoms and new hatreds gave birth to a new movement that would transform Jewish history. Fact 1. Jewish emancipation in Europe. Beginning in the late 18th century, a wave of legal reforms swept through parts of Europe, gradually granting Jews civil rights and citizenship. In 1791, revolutionary France became the first European nation to emancipate its Jews fully, declaring them equal citizens with the same rights as all Frenchmen. As Napoleon's armies conquered much of Europe, they brought emancipation with them, knocking down ghetto walls and granting Jews legal equality. After Napoleon's defeat, some of these gains were rolled back, but the idea had taken root. Throughout the 19th century, one European country after another extended citizenship to Jews. The German states gradually over decades, culminating in full emancipation in 1871 when Germany unified. Britain progressively throughout the century. Austria-Hungary in 1867. With emancipation came the removal of residential restrictions, the opening of universities and professions previously closed to Jews, the right to own land, to vote, to hold public office. Jews could now live where they chose, pursue any career, participate fully in society. This was a revolutionary change after centuries of legal discrimination. Many Jews embraced the opportunity enthusiastically, entering universities in large numbers, distinguishing themselves in medicine, law, journalism, science, and the arts. Emancipation seemed to promise that the long nightmare of persecution and exclusion was ending, that Jews could finally become full members of European society while maintaining their religious identity. It was a moment of tremendous hope and possibility. Fact 2. Haskalah encourages integration. The Jewish Enlightenment, called Haskalah in Hebrew, was an intellectual movement that encouraged Jews to embrace European culture, modern education, and integration into general society. Beginning in Berlin in the late 18th century, led by figures like Moses Mendelssohn, the Haskalah promoted the idea that Jews should learn the languages of their countries, study secular subjects alongside religious texts, dress like their neighbors, and participate in the cultural and intellectual life of the nations where they lived. Maskilim, the proponents of a Haskalah, argued that this would combat anti-Semitism by showing that Jews were not fundamentally foreign or backward, and would benefit Jews by opening up new opportunities and ways of thinking. The Haskalah spread eastward from Germany through the Austrian Empire and eventually into the Russian Pale of Settlement. It created a new type of Jew, educated in both traditional Jewish learning and modern European culture, comfortable in multiple worlds, able to move between Jewish and general society. The Haskalah encouraged the reform of Jewish education, the translation of prayers into vernacular languages, the modification of traditional practices to accord with modern sensibilities. For many, it represented progress, the emergence of Judaism from medieval isolation into the modern world. But it also created tensions within Jewish communities, between those who embraced change and those who saw it as a threat to authentic Jewish life, between tradition and modernity, between particularism and universalism. Fact 3. Assimilation fractures identity. As emancipation and Haskalah opened doors, many Jews moved beyond integration toward full assimilation, abandoning Jewish practice, converting to Christianity for social or professional advancement, or simply drifting away from Jewish identity altogether. Intermarriage rates increased. Many Jews stopped observing the Sabbath and dietary laws, stopped attending synagogue, stopped teaching their children Hebrew or Jewish history. Some changed their names to sound less Jewish. The great composer Felix Mendelssohn was born to a Jewish family, but was baptized as a child. Heinrich Heine, the German poet, converted to Christianity, calling the baptismal certificate the entrance ticket to European culture. For many, the price of acceptance seemed to be the abandonment of distinctiveness. This created a fracturing of Jewish identity. Reform Judaism emerged, attempting to create a modern form of Judaism compatible with integration, emphasizing ethics over ritual, universal values over particularism. Orthodox Judaism reacted by strengthening traditional observance, drawing clearer boundaries. Conservative Judaism tried to find a middle path. Jewish communities that had been relatively unified in their practices for centuries now split into competing movements with different visions of what Judaism should be. Some predicted that within a few generations, emancipated Jews would simply disappear through assimilation, that Jewish identity could not survive freedom and equality. The fracturing raised profound questions. What did it mean to be Jewish if not religious observance? Could Jewish identity exist as purely ethnic or cultural? Was the price of acceptance the loss of Jewish distinctiveness? Fact 4. Modern anti-Semitism rises. Just as legal equality seemed to promise a new era, a new form of anti-Semitism emerged, no longer primarily based on religious differences, but on racial theories and economic resentment. This modern anti-Semitism portrayed Jews not as adherents of a false religion who could be saved through conversion, but as a fundamentally alien race that could never truly belong to European nations, regardless of how integrated they became. Racial anti-Semites argued that Jewish characteristics were inherited and unchangeable, that Jews were engaged in a conspiracy to dominate European society through control of finance and media, that Jewish emancipation was a mistake that needed to be reversed. Political parties formed around anti-Semitic platforms. Newspapers published anti-Semitic propaganda. In Vienna, Karl Lueger won election as mayor on an explicitly anti-Semitic platform. In France, Édouard Drumon's anti-Semitic book, La France Juive, became a bestseller. In Germany, scholars developed elaborate racial theories, categorizing Jews as Semites, inferior to Aryan peoples. This new anti-Semitism was particularly bitter because it suggested that emancipation had solved nothing, that no matter how educated Jews became, how patriotic, how culturally integrated, they would always be seen as foreign, as threatening. The rise of modern anti-Semitism revealed that legal equality did not automatically translate to social acceptance, that hatred could adapt its justifications from religious to racial grounds, that the promise of emancipation might be hollow. Fact 5. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion spreads. In the early 1900s, a fabricated document called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion began to circulate widely, becoming one of the most influential anti-Semitic texts in history. The protocols purported to be the minutes of secret meetings of Jewish leaders plotting to achieve world domination through control of the economy, media, and governments. It was a complete fabrication, created by agents of the Russian Tsarist secret police, largely plagiarized from earlier satirical works that had nothing to do with Jews. Yet the protocols were presented as authentic and were believed by millions. The text, spread throughout Europe, was translated into dozens of languages, was published in newspapers, was cited by political leaders. In the 1920s, Henry Ford sponsored the publication of the protocols in the United States. The Nazi regime in Germany used it as propaganda to justify persecution of Jews. Even after the text was definitively exposed as a fraud through historical investigation and court proceedings, it continued to circulate and be believed. The protocols fed into conspiracy theories portraying Jews as a secret force manipulating world events, as enemies of all other peoples, as a threat that needed to be combated. The widespread acceptance of such an obvious forgery demonstrated how deeply anti-Semitic beliefs had penetrated European and later global culture, how ready people were to believe the worst about Jews, how facts mattered less than the emotional appeal of conspiracy theories that offered simple explanations for complex social problems. Fact 6. Russian pogroms intensify fear. The wave of pogroms in Russia during the 1880s, and again in the early 1900s, had a profound impact on Jewish consciousness. These were not isolated incidents, but sustained campaigns of violence affecting hundreds of communities. The pogroms of 1881 to 1884, following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, destroyed Jewish homes and businesses across southern Russia and Ukraine. The Kishinev pogrom of 1903 shocked the world with its brutality. 49 Jews murdered, hundreds injured, Jewish homes and shops systematically destroyed over 2 days while police stood by. The worst violence came during the revolutionary period of 1918 to 1921, when pogroms in Ukraine killed an estimated 50,000 to 200,000 Jews. These attacks demonstrated several things: that Jews in the Russian Empire lived in constant danger, that authorities would not protect them and often encouraged violence against them, that traditional strategies of survival through accommodation were failing, that exile in Eastern Europe was becoming untenable. The pogroms triggered mass emigration. Over 2 million Jews left the Russian Empire between 1880 and 1914, most going to the United States. But the pogroms also prompted a different response among some. If Jews were not safe in exile, if Gentile nations would not protect them, then perhaps Jews needed to protect themselves, needed their own territory, their own state, where they would not be at the mercy of hostile majorities. The intensification of pogroms created a sense of urgency, a feeling that the Jewish situation required radical solutions, not just continued adaptation to life in diaspora. Fact 7. Political Zionism emerges. Against this background of emancipation's disappointments, rising anti-Semitism, and violent persecution, a new movement emerged: political Zionism. Earlier forms of Zionism had existed: religious Zionism that prayed for messianic return, cultural Zionism that sought to revive Hebrew and Jewish culture, practical Zionism that promoted small-scale immigration to Palestine. But political Zionism was something new, a secular nationalist movement that sought to establish a Jewish state through diplomatic and political means to transform the religious hope of return into a concrete political program. Political Zionism argued that the Jewish problem, anti-Semitism, persecution, homelessness, could only be solved by Jewish sovereignty in a territory where Jews would be the majority and control their own destiny. It was influenced by 19th century nationalism, the ideology that every people should have its own state, just as Italians had unified Italy and Germans had unified Germany, so Jews should have their own state. Political Zionism was controversial from the start. Many religious Jews felt it was blasphemous to try to hasten the messianic redemption through human political action. Many assimilated Jews felt it undermined their claims to belong to their European nations. Socialists argued that revolution, not nationalism, was the answer. But political Zionism offered something powerful: hope that Jewish powerlessness could end, that the long history of persecution and exile could be brought to a close, that Jews could take their fate into their own hands. Fact 8. Herzl calls for a Jewish state. The face of political Zionism was Theodor Herzl, a Viennese journalist who transformed Zionism from a marginal idea into an international movement. Herzl was an assimilated Jew who spoke German, not Yiddish, who knew little of Jewish tradition, who had believed that integration into European society was the path forward. But his coverage of the Dreyfus affair in Paris, where a Jewish army officer was falsely convicted of treason amid widespread anti-Semitic agitation, convinced him that anti-Semitism was ineradicable in Europe, that Jews would never be fully accepted. In 1896, Herzl published Der Judenstaat, The Jewish State, a short book laying out his vision. He argued that Jews constituted a nation, that they needed a state like any other nation, that this state should be established through negotiation with the great powers, that it would solve the Jewish problem by providing a refuge and a homeland. Herzl was not particularly concerned with where this state would be. He considered Argentina and other locations alongside Palestine. What mattered to him was Jewish sovereignty, Jewish self-determination, an end to the vulnerability of exile. Herzl's pamphlet created a sensation, attracting both enthusiastic supporters and fierce critics. But Herzl had something that earlier Zionist thinkers lacked: political ambition and organizational skill. He began lobbying European leaders, seeking support for his plan. He met with the German Kaiser, with the Ottoman Sultan, with the British colonial secretary. He was tireless, charismatic, convinced that his vision could be realized within his lifetime. Fact 9. First Zionist Congress in 1897. In August 1897, Herzl convened the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Over 200 delegates from 17 countries gathered in a concert hall to discuss the creation of a Jewish state. The Congress was organized like a parliament, with speeches, debates, voting on resolutions. Delegates wore formal attire. Herzl insisted on dignity, on presenting Zionism as a serious political movement, not a messianic fantasy. The Congress established the World Zionist Organization to coordinate the movement's activities. It adopted a platform, the Basel Program, which carefully stated that Zionism sought to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured by public law. The phrase Jewish state was avoided to reduce opposition from the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine. The Congress created institutions, a bank to fund land purchases and settlements, a newspaper to spread Zionist ideas, committees to lobby governments and promote immigration. The Congress elected Herzl as president, and he served until his death in 1904. Perhaps most importantly, the Congress created a sense of possibility. Here were Jews from across the world, speaking different languages, coming from different traditions, united by a shared national vision. After the Congress, Herzl wrote in his diary, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, and certainly in 50, everyone will know it." He was remarkably prescient. 51 years later, in 1948, the State of Israel was established. Fact 10. Return to Zion becomes political. For nearly 2 millennia, the hope of return to Zion had been primarily religious and messianic. Something Jews prayed for, something God would bring about at the end of days. something to await rather than to work toward politically. The Zionist movement transformed this hope into a political program with concrete goals and practical methods. Return was no longer something to pray for, but something to plan for, to organize, to negotiate, to build. This was revolutionary and controversial. It meant not waiting for the Messiah, but taking action in the present, not relying on divine intervention, but on human effort, diplomacy, settlement, and eventually military force. It meant redefining Jewish identity in nationalist terms. Jews were not just a religious community, but a nation like other nations, with a historical connection to a specific territory, with a right to political sovereignty in that territory. The politicization of return changed the nature of the aspiration. It was no longer enough to maintain Jewish identity in exile while awaiting redemption. Now, there was a program for ending exile, for making return a reality within the lifetimes of people then living. This political dimension attracted some Jews powerfully, especially those suffering persecution, those who had lost faith in the promises of emancipation, those who wanted to be masters of their own fate. But it also created new divisions, new debates about whether this political program was legitimate, whether it was wise, whether it could succeed, and what price it might require. The return to Zion, once a universally shared religious hope expressed in prayer, had become a contested political project that would reshape Jewish history and the history of the Middle East. Let these transformations, these debates, these new possibilities settle into stillness now. The turn toward modernity and the birth of new dreams fade gently as sleep deepens. As you rest deeply now, we come to the final act, the most dramatic turn in this long story. 10 facts about unimaginable loss and unexpected rebirth. Fact 1. Jewish Legion fights in World War I. During the First World War, a unique military unit was formed, the Jewish Legion, battalions of Jewish volunteers who fought for the British against the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine. The idea was promoted by Ze'ev Jabotinsky and Joseph Trumpeldor, Zionist leaders who believed that Jewish military service on the side of the British would help secure support for Zionist aims after the war. Initially, the British were reluctant, but eventually they authorized the formation of several battalions, the 38th, 39th, and 40th Battalions of the Royal Fusiliers, composed of Jewish volunteers from Britain, America, Canada, and Palestine itself. About 5,000 men served in these units, wearing the distinctive Star of David insignia on their uniforms. They trained in Egypt and then participated in General Allenby's campaign to conquer Palestine from the Ottomans. The Jewish Legion fought at the Battle of Megiddo and participated in the capture of territories in the Jordan Valley. For many, service in the Jewish Legion was deeply meaningful. It was the first time in nearly 2 millennia that a distinctly Jewish military force had fought for the land of Israel. Among those who served was David Ben-Gurion, who would later become Israel's first prime minister. The Jewish Legion was disbanded after the war, but it had demonstrated that Jews could fight as soldiers, could form military units, could contribute to their own redemption through force of arms. It was a step away from 2,000 years of Jewish powerlessness. Fact 2. Balfour Declaration issued. On November 2nd, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a letter to Lord Rothschild, a prominent British Jewish leader, declaring that His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. and would work to facilitate this objective. This brief statement, known as the Balfour Declaration, was the first time a major power had officially endorsed the Zionist program. It came after years of Zionist lobbying, particularly by Chaim Weizmann, a chemist whose work for the British war effort had given him access to government leaders. The declaration was motivated by various factors: sympathy for Zionist aims, strategic interests in having a friendly population in Palestine after the war, hopes of gaining Jewish support for the Allied cause, and the personal convictions of British officials like Prime Minister Lloyd George, who had religious attachments to the idea of Jewish return to the Holy Land. For Zionists, the Balfour Declaration was a tremendous victory. Recognition in international law of Jewish national aspirations, a commitment from the most powerful empire in the world. The declaration was carefully worded. It spoke of a national home rather than a state, and it included provisions protecting the rights of non-Jewish populations in Palestine. But it gave the Zionist movement something crucial: international legitimacy, a foundation in diplomatic recognition upon which to build. The declaration would later be incorporated into the British Mandate for Palestine approved by the League of Nations, making it part of international law. Fact 3. British Mandate restricts immigration. After World War I, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to govern Palestine, with the explicit responsibility to implement the Balfour Declaration. Jewish immigration increased. Thousands, then tens of thousands of Jews came to Palestine, especially from Eastern Europe, where pogroms and economic hardship made life increasingly difficult. The Jewish community in Palestine, known as the Yishuv, grew from about 60,000 in 1918 to over 400,000 by 1936. New cities were built. Agricultural settlements were established. Hebrew was revived as a living language. Institutions of self-governance were created. But this immigration provoked resistance from the Arab population, who saw their demographic dominance threatened and feared being reduced to a minority in what they considered their land. Arab riots and attacks on Jewish communities occurred in 1920, 1921, 1929, and developed into a sustained revolt from 1936 to 1939. The British, trying to maintain order and protect their strategic interests, began restricting Jewish immigration. Various white papers and commissions proposed limits, quotas based on economic absorptive capacity, restrictions on land purchases. The British were caught between their commitment to facilitate a Jewish national home and their desire to maintain good relations with the Arab population and with Arab states whose cooperation they needed for their wider Middle Eastern interests. The restrictions frustrated Zionists who saw unlimited immigration as essential to their project and who watched with growing alarm as the situation for Jews in Europe deteriorated. Fact 4. White Paper of 1939. In May 1939, as war clouds gathered over Europe, the British government issued the White Paper of 1939, which fundamentally reversed their policy on Palestine. Responding to the Arab revolt and seeking to secure Arab support before the anticipated war, the White Paper declared that it was not British policy that Palestine should become a Jewish state. It imposed strict limits on Jewish immigration. Only 75,000 Jews would be allowed to enter over the next 5 years, after which immigration would require Arab consent, which meant effectively no more immigration. It also restricted Jewish land purchases in most of Palestine. The White Paper envisioned an independent Palestinian state within 10 years, in which Jews would be a permanent minority. For the Zionist movement, this was a betrayal of the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate, a closing of the gates just when European Jews most desperately needed refuge. The timing was catastrophic. This policy was implemented just months before the outbreak of World War II, just as Nazi Germany was beginning its systematic persecution of European Jewry. Throughout the Holocaust, while millions of Jews were being murdered, the British enforced the immigration restrictions, turning back ships carrying refugees, interning illegal immigrants, maintaining quotas even as the full horror of the Nazi genocide became known. The White Paper created lasting bitterness among Jews toward British policy, convincing many that the British had broken faith, that Jews could not depend on the promises of great powers, that only Jewish sovereignty could ensure Jewish survival. Fact 5. Holocaust murders. 6 million Jews. During World War II, Nazi Germany and its collaborators systematically murdered approximately 6 million Jews, 2/3 of European Jewry, 1/3 of the world's Jewish population. This genocide, which came to be known as the Holocaust or Shoah, was unprecedented in its scale, its systematic organization, its attempt to completely annihilate an entire people. The Nazis began with persecution, stripping Jews of citizenship rights, forcing them into ghettos, using them as slave labor. Then came mobile killing squads that shot Jews in occupied Soviet territories. Finally came the death camps: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, industrial facilities designed for mass murder, where victims were killed in gas chambers and their bodies burned in crematoria. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were wiped out. The great centers of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, the shtetls, the academies, the vibrant Yiddish culture, were destroyed. Ancient communities in Greece, Hungary, the Netherlands, France, and other countries were decimated. The Holocaust shattered Jewish existence in Europe, created a rupture in Jewish history, left survivors traumatized and displaced. It also vindicated, in the most horrible way possible, the Zionist argument that Jews were not safe in exile, that without their own state they were vulnerable to annihilation. The Holocaust made the question of Jewish sovereignty not theoretical but urgent. Those who survived, those who managed to reach displaced persons camps after liberation, had nowhere to return to. Their homes were gone, their families murdered, their communities destroyed. They needed refuge, and Palestine was the place most wanted to go. But British restrictions remained in force. Fact 6. Exodus, 1947. Shocks world opinion. In July 1947, a ship called Exodus 1947 left France carrying 4,500 Jewish refugees, Holocaust survivors who were trying to reach Palestine illegally, in defiance of British immigration restrictions. Most were women, children, and elderly people, survivors of concentration camps, displaced persons who had nothing left in Europe and desperately wanted to reach the Jewish community in Palestine. The British intercepted the ship near the Palestinian coast. In the confrontation that followed, British forces boarded the ship, using clubs and tear gas. 3 passengers were killed and dozens injured. The British then made a decision that shocked the world. Rather than interning the refugees in camps in Cyprus, as they usually did with illegal immigrants, they forced the passengers back onto ships and sent them to Germany, to the country where the Holocaust had been perpetrated, the last place Holocaust survivors wanted to be. The refugees refused to disembark in France, staging a protest on the ships. When the ships reached Germany, British soldiers had to forcibly remove the refugees, carrying some bodily off the ships while the world's press photographed the scene. The images of Holocaust survivors being forcibly returned to Germany caused international outrage. The incident dramatized the plight of Jewish refugees with nowhere to go, the cruelty of British policy, the desperation that drove people to risk everything to reach Palestine. The Exodus affair influenced world opinion, building sympathy for the Zionist cause and contributing to the growing sense that the Palestine question needed to be resolved, that the British mandate was unsustainable. Fact 7. UN Partition Plan of 1947. In 1947, Britain, exhausted by World War II and unable to manage the conflict in Palestine between Jews and Arabs, announced it would relinquish the mandate and turn the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. The UN established a special committee on Palestine, which investigated the situation and recommended partition, dividing Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to adopt this partition plan, Resolution 181. The vote was 33 in favour, 13 against, with 10 abstentions. The proposed Jewish state would comprise roughly 55% of Palestine's territory, including the coastal plain, the Galilee, and the Negev desert, areas where Jews were the majority or where there was undeveloped land. The Arab state would include the Central Highlands, the Gaza area, and other regions. The vote was the result of intense diplomatic lobbying by both sides. The United States and the Soviet Union both supported partition. Unusual Cold War allies brought together on this issue. Arab states and the Arab population of Palestine rejected the partition plan, refusing to accept the creation of a Jewish state on any part of Palestine, which they saw as their land. For Zionists, the UN vote was a historic moment. International recognition of Jewish statehood, legitimacy in international law for their project. The partition plan provided only 55% of Palestine, much less than Zionists had hoped for, and the proposed borders were militarily difficult to defend. But it offered what decades of effort had been aimed at: international authorization to establish a Jewish state. Fact 8. Jewish leadership accepts partition. On November 29, 1947, when the UN partition resolution passed, Jewish communities in Palestine and around the world celebrated. In Tel Aviv, crowds danced in the streets. Synagogues held services of thanksgiving. But the Jewish leadership, led by David Ben-Gurion, faced a difficult decision. The proposed partition gave Jews less territory than they wanted, created a state with borders that seemed almost indefensible, and would leave significant Arab populations within the Jewish state and significant Jewish populations outside it, particularly in Jerusalem. Some Zionist factions, particularly the revisionist movement led by Menachem Begin, rejected partition, demanding all of historic Palestine. But Ben-Gurion and the mainstream Zionist leadership decided to accept partition. They recognized that this might be the only opportunity, that rejecting the UN plan risked losing international support, that while the borders were problematic, sovereignty, even over part of Palestine, was better than continued mandate status or no state at all. They calculated that a Jewish state, once established, would be able to defend itself and potentially expand. Most importantly, they understood that Holocaust survivors desperately needed a refuge, that time was running out, that the world's sympathy for the Jewish plight might not last. The acceptance of partition was pragmatic rather than enthusiastic, a recognition that politics is the art of the possible, that perfect solutions rarely exist, that this imperfect plan offered a chance that might not come again. The decision to accept partition set the stage for statehood, but also for the immediate war that would follow. Fact 9. 1948. State of Israel declared. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate was set to expire at midnight, David Ben-Gurion stood in the Tel Aviv Museum and read the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the establishment of the State of Israel. The declaration invoked the Jewish people's historical connection to the land, the suffering of the Holocaust, the right of the Jewish people to sovereignty in their homeland. It promised equality for all citizens regardless of religion, race or gender. It called for peace with neighboring Arab states. The declaration was signed by the members of the provisional government, representing different Zionist parties. After nearly 2,000 years, Jewish political sovereignty was restored. There was a Jewish state, a place where Jews would be the majority, where Jewish refugees could find haven, where Jewish culture and the Hebrew language would flourish, where Jews would control their own destiny. The declaration was broadcast by radio. There was no time for elaborate ceremonies, because everyone knew that war was imminent. Indeed, within hours of the declaration, Arab armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded, seeking to crush the new state in its infancy. The War of Independence that followed would claim the lives of 1% of Israel's Jewish population, 6,000 dead out of 600,000, but Israel survived. Against expectations, the new state defeated the invasion, secured its existence, expanded its territory beyond the UN partition borders. The establishment of Israel was perhaps the most dramatic political reversal in history. A people who had been stateless refugees, who'd been scattered across the world, who had been powerless for 2 millennia, had created a state and successfully defended it against immediate military assault. Fact 10. Jewish sovereignty restored after 2,000 years. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 marked the end of the longest exile in Jewish history. Since the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 Sidki CE and the crushing of the Bar Kokhba Revolt in 135 CE, Jews had lived without political sovereignty, without a state of their own, scattered in diaspora communities across the world. They had maintained their identity through all those centuries, through text and tradition, through communal institutions, through the bonds of peoplehood, through the hope preserved in prayer that one day they would return. Now that return had happened, not through messianic miracle, but through political organization, diplomatic effort, settlement, and armed struggle. The long history we have traced together through these 100 facts, the fall of the ancient kingdoms, the Babylonian exile, the brief Hasmonean independence, the Roman destruction, the development of Rabbinic Judaism, the expulsions and persecutions of the Middle Ages, the pogroms of Eastern Europe, the Holocaust, all of it had led to this moment. The restoration of sovereignty meant that Jews now had what they had lacked for 2,000 years, a place of refuge, a government they controlled, an army to defend them, the ability to make their own decisions about their collective future. It meant that next year in Jerusalem, recited at Passover Seders for generations, was no longer just a hope, but a possibility, a place people could actually go. It meant the end of the particular vulnerability, that had characterized Jewish existence in exile, the dependence on the tolerance or indifference of Gentile rulers. The restoration of Jewish sovereignty after 2,000 years was an ending and a beginning, the end of the long period covered by these 100 facts, the end of powerlessness, and the beginning of a new chapter in Jewish history, one in which Jews would face new challenges, but would face them with the tools of statehood, in their own land, masters of their own fate. Rest now. The long journey is complete. 2,000 years of exile have given way to restoration. Let this resolution, this unexpected turn, settle into the peaceful depths of sleep. The ancient story has reached its modern conclusion. Let all these facts, all these centuries, fade now into stillness and rest. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe and click the bell icon to receive notifications about new videos. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.